Welcome to Dickensian Sleep Story, dear listener, where the lamps burn softly, the streets glow amber through the mist, and every small kindness has time to reach its destination. Before we step into tonight's tale, allow your body to settle as if you've just come in from the cold. Let your breathing slow, easy in, and gentler out. Unclench your jaw as though you're loosening a ribbon. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears and feel the weight of your blankets find you, as if they've been waiting all evening to do exactly this job. If your hands are holding anything, thoughts, plans, the day's little knots, let them rest open, palms softened as though they've set down a basket at last. Take one more slow breath and imagine the warmth of a cup between your fingers, the kind that sends comfort up your arms in a quiet, steady climb. And while you're settling there, cozy and safe, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? If these Victorian sleep stories bring you comfort, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Now, let that invitation fade like a footstep in snow, and come with me into a winter night where fog drifts under gaslight, where hearth fire waits behind curtained windows, and where Ludgate Hill holds its hush like a secret kept kindly. In Victorian London, a Dickensian hush lay over the cobbles, and this sleep story began with fog and gaslight gathering like silk around the hearth-warm windows of Ludgate Hill. The boarding house stood a little back from the main rise of the hill, as if it preferred to listen rather than be looked at. Its bricks were dark with age and damp. Its door painted a respectable colour that had once been green and now had the patience of old velvet. The knocker, lion-faced and solemn, caught the lamplight with a tired shine, and the step before it was worn into a shallow hollow by years of careful boots and hurried ones alike. Inside, the parlour was the sort of room that had learned how to make do, and how to make do gracefully. A coal fire glowed behind its grate, not roaring, not demanding, but steadily doing its work, turning cold air into something kinder. The kettle sat near the edge of the fender, with its blackened belly turned toward the warmth, and a faint perfume of tea leaves lingered in the curtains, as if it had taken up residence there long ago. Matilda Crown sat in the armchair that faced the hearth at a slight angle, so the firelight warmed her cheek without drying her eyes. She was in that middle season of life, 40-something, perhaps 50 by the calendar's strictest account, yet with a softness about her that made age seem less a number than a manner. Her voice, when she used it, was the kind that did not startle a sleeping cat. Her hands were capable hands that had measured tea by instinct, tied parcels with twine, soothed a child's hair into place, and counted coins without making the coins feel accused. Widowhood had given her a quiet steadiness that did not show itself in speeches or sighs, but in how she kept the world arranged so that others might rest inside it. She had once had her own tea shop, no grand establishment, just a neat room with a bell above the door and a window that caught the afternoon sun. When her husband died, the shop had slipped away, not with drama, but with the slow inevitability of water finding the lowest ground. She had taken rooms here at the Ludgate Hill boarding house, and in time, the landlady had come to rely on her in small ways, pouring tea for lodgers, mending a cuff, keeping the parlour a place where silence could be friendly instead of lonely. Tonight, the silence was thoughtful. The mantel clock ticked in an even, unhurried voice. Outside, somewhere beyond the parlour's thick curtains, a carriage rolled past with its wheels softened by frost, and the sound came through like distant thunder under a blanket. Now and then, a gust pressed against the window panes and retreated, leaving behind the faintest rattle of the sash. Matilda had a teacup on the small table at her elbow. She did not drink it quickly. She took the warmth as one might take a story slowly, letting it do its work. It was not only the night that made her linger in the parlour. There was, to be honest, a small expectation sitting with her, perched on the edge of her thoughts like a cautious visitor. A newcomer had been spoken of, nothing official, nothing written in the ledger with a flourish. Simply a message passed from the landlady in the afternoon, half practical, half hopeful. "Another lodger may come," Mrs. Pinner had said, smoothing her apron as she spoke, as if the sentence might crease. "A gentleman from out of town, so the word goes. He's inquired for a room, and well, if he comes, he'll come late. Winter roads, and all that." A gentleman from out of town, a weary newcomer. Matilda had nodded then, and later she had found herself setting an extra chair nearer the hearth, as if a chair could be an invitation the fog might deliver. Now the chair waited, empty but not unfriendly, its cushion catching the firelight like a patient smile. Matilda listened to the house. A boarding house had its own manner of breathing stairs that remembered each footfall, pipes that sighed, doors that spoke softly when they settled into their frames. Above, a lodger coughed once, the sound muffled by floors and the polite restraint of strangers. Somewhere else, a page turned, perhaps someone reading by candlelight, perhaps someone only pretending to read while their thoughts wandered. Matilda's own thoughts wandered too, but they did not go far. They kept returning to the same gentle longing, that everyone, tonight, might find warmth before the last coal gave up its glow. She rose at last, not because she was restless, but because there were small tasks that felt like prayers when performed quietly. She checked the kettle, topped it with a little water, and shifted it an inch closer to the heat. She folded a spare blanket wool, a shade between brown and plum, and laid it over the back of the waiting chair. Then, as if completing the scene, she placed a small plate of biscuits on the sideboard and covered them with a cloth to keep the parlour from smelling too inviting too soon. A kindness, like tea, was best when it arrived at the right moment. When she had finished, she stood with her hands resting lightly on the back of her own chair, and she looked into the fire. In the dancing coals she saw, for a moment, the old tea-shop window steam blooming on the glass, the bell's little ring as someone entered, the neat rows of tins behind the counter, with their labels written in careful script. She did not ache the way she once had. The memory came now with a tenderness that did not ask anything from her except to be acknowledged. A small sound at the parlour door drew her attention, a soft rap, as courteous as it was hesitant. "Come in," Matilda said, and her voice seemed to warm the air by itself. The door opened just enough for a slim figure to appear, Oliver Twist, with his gentle eyes and his manner of entering a room as though he wished to do it no harm. He was older than the boy people might have remembered in harsher stories. Older, yes, but still carrying that same earnestness, softened now into something like quiet capability. He had a scarf wound round his throat, and his cheeks held the faint pink of cold air. He looked, as he often did, like someone who had learned to value warmth not as a luxury, but as a kind of truth. "Mrs. Crown," he said, stepping in and closing the door behind him with care. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Matilda replied. "You never do. Come nearer the fire, your hands must be chilled." Oliver obeyed, holding his palms toward the grate for a moment, as if the heat might read them like pages. Then he glanced at the extra chair, the blanket, the covered plate. "A guest?" he asked, his tone light, as though the idea pleased him. "Perhaps," said Matilda. "Perhaps not, but I like to be ready, all the same." Oliver nodded, as if this answered something inside him as well as the question itself. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I've brought you those tea leaves Mr. Fagin promised," he said. "The ones from the little tin with the painted ship." Matilda's face softened. "That old tin again? He does love his treasures. He says the ship's still sailing. If you look at it the right way," Oliver said, and there was the faintest smile in his voice. Matilda accepted the parcel with both hands, as though it were delicate. When she unwrapped the paper, a scent rose up bergamot and something floral, like a memory of summer hidden in a drawer. "Oh," she murmured, "that is kind." Oliver glanced around the parlour as if checking that everything was in its place, the kettle, the cloth, the careful quiet. He had the habit of noticing what made a room feel safe. It was one of his gifts. "Mr. Fagin asked me to tell you," he said, "that he's keeping his lamp lit a little longer tonight. He said he had something for you, something you might want to see." Matilda paused with the tea leaves in her hands. "For me?" Oliver's brows lifted slightly. "So," he said. "And Jack Dawkins," he said, "the fog's thicker nearer the crest of the hill, and if you mean to walk, you'd best do it sooner than later." He used those very words, sooner than later. It sounded quite grand coming from him. Matilda gave a small laugh, more breath than sound. Jack Dawkins is often grand, in his way. Oliver's eyes warmed. "He is, but he means well, Mrs. Crown. He does." "I know," Matilda said gently. "I know he does." She set the parcel on the table and looked toward the window, though the curtains were drawn. Outside was London vast, complicated London, yet the idea of stepping into it did not frighten her. She had walked its streets in all weathers, carrying trays of tea, bundles of cloth, parcels tied with string. She had done it alone and still found herself accompanied by the city's sounds, the rumble of wheels, the distant bell, the murmur of voices, the soft persistence of life. And yet, tonight, there was a particular feeling in the air, as if the fog were holding something close. What could he have for me? She wondered aloud. Oliver tilted his head. He wouldn't say. Only that it might be useful. For a kindness. Matilda's heart gave a small, steady beat. A kindness. She felt, suddenly, as if the extra chair by the fire had leaned forward to listen. "Thank you, Oliver," she said. "Will you sit a moment? I'll pour you a cup, and then I believe I shall go and see Mr. Fagin." Oliver looked pleased at the offer, but he shook his head. "I'd like to, truly, but I promised to bring something back for him. He said his teapot lid has gone missing again, and he suspects it's trying to start a new life in a drawer." Matilda smiled. "That sounds like him. Then take a biscuit for the road. The plate's covered, but they're there." Oliver hesitated the way kind people sometimes do, as if accepting even a biscuit might unbalance the world's accounts. Matilda lifted the cloth and selected one for him, pressing it into his hand with the calm certainty of someone who knew that giving was not a thing to apologize for. "Thank you," Oliver said, and meant it with his whole face. When he had gone, the parlour felt warmer than before, as though his quiet presence had left behind an extra coal's worth of glow. Matilda took her shawl from the peg by the door, thick, dark, smelling faintly of lavender water, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She did not rush. She checked the kettle once more, banked the fire so it would burn steadily, and left a note for Mrs. Pinner on the sideboard. "Gone to see Mr. Fagin. Back soon. Fire is safe." Then she stepped into the entryway, took up her small lantern more for comfort than necessity, as the street lamps did their work, and opened the front door. The night met her like a hush made visible. Fog hung in the air, not heavy, not choking, but thick enough to soften the edges of everything. The gas lamps along the street wore halos, their light blooming outward into the mist as though each flame were wrapped in gauze. The cobbles gleamed with damp where frost had melted into a fine sheen. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily from a gutter, the sound as patient as the clock in the parlour. Matilda pulled her shawl tighter and stepped onto the pavement. Ludgate Hill rose ahead, a gentle incline made grand by the buildings that lined its stone and brick. Windows dimmed for the night, signs creaking faintly on their brackets. Farther up, the silhouette of street. Paul's Dome was only a suggestion, swallowed and offered back again by the fog's shifting mood. She walked with the steady pace of someone who had learned not to argue with winter. Her boots made soft, careful sounds. The lantern in her hand bobbed slightly, its flame steady behind the glass. At the corner, near a narrow bookshop doorway beneath a hissing gas lamp, she saw a figure leaning as if he belonged to the lamppost itself. Jack Dawkins, the Artful Dodger, turned as she approached, and his grin appeared before his full face did, as if it had stepped out of the fog to greet her. "Evening, Mrs. Crown," he said with a bow that managed to be both polite and theatrical. His cap sat at a jaunty angle, and his coat, though worn, was brushed clean, as if he took pride in meeting the world neatly, even when the world met him with fog. "Good evening, Jack," Matilda replied. "Oliver said you'd a warning for me." "A warning," Jack repeated, putting a hand to his chest as though the word were a medal. "No, only advice. And the very finest sort. Fog's thick as porridge higher up, and the lamps are playing tricks with the corners. But you've got your lantern, and you've got your wits. And if you'll allow me the honour, I can point you along the best way." Matilda eyed him with fondness. "You are very generous with other people's directions." Jack chuckled. "Directions cost me nothing, and they make me feel like a gentleman of importance, which is a rare pleasure, I assure you." The bookshop behind him was closed, its door fitted with a small brass plate that caught the gaslight. In the window, old volumes rested like sleeping creatures, spines faded, titles half hidden, as if they preferred mystery. The lamp above hissed steadily, and every so often it gave a tiny flutter, like a sigh. "You've been standing out here some time," Matilda observed. "Only long enough to become acquainted with every draught in London," Jack said. "Besides, Mr. Fagin asked me to keep an eye. He said you might come by, and if you did, I was to make sure you didn't get turned about and end up drinking cocoa in Fleet Street by accident." Matilda smiled. "Fleet Street is not so terrible. No, but it's crowded with opinions," Jack said gravely, as if that were the worst of dangers. "I am," Matilda said. "Oliver said he's something for me, something useful." Jack's expression shifted into something almost tender beneath the playfulness. "Ah," he said softly. "That'll be the map then." Matilda paused mid-step. "The map?" Jack nodded. his grin gentling. A little hand-drawn thing. Mr. Fagin did it himself, hunched over his counter with his spectacles right on the end of his nose. He was muttering street names like they were charms. Ludgate Hill, he kept saying, and a gatehouse, and a chapel, and a parlour with a fire. He drew it as careful as if he were drawing a portrait. Matilda felt something settle into place in her chest, like a key finding its lock. "Who is it for?" "A newcomer," Jack said, and for once he did not embellish the words. "A weary one, too. Came in looking like he'd been walking since last Christmas. He asked for somewhere warm, somewhere quiet, somewhere he might belong without being looked at like a question. Mr. Fagin, well, he can't resist a good question, but he likes answering kind ones. So he drew the map, and he told the fellow how to find it." "And did the fellow take it?" Matilda asked. Jack made a face. "He tried. But you know how it is when you've been cold too long, you start doubting every warm light is meant for you." He thanked Mr. Fagin very polite, and then he went out without the map in his pocket, left it sitting there on the counter like a forgotten biscuit. Matilda's throat tightened, not with sorrow, but with that particular tenderness she always felt for people who could not quite accept help. "So Mr. Fagin kept it," she murmured. "He did," Jack said. "And now he's hoping you'll do what you do best." "And what is that?" Matilda asked, though she suspected the answer. Jack spread his hands toward the foggy street as if presenting it to her. "Make a place feel like it was expecting someone all along." Matilda breathed out slowly. The cold air touched her lips and faded. "Then I must not keep him waiting," she said. Jack fell into step beside her, walking on the outside nearest the road like a self-appointed guardian of manners. "No need to hurry," he said at once, hearing something in her tone. "We'll go steady. The fog rewards patience. Besides, if you rush, you miss all the best light." They walked together up Ludgate Hill, their shadows stretching and shortening in the gas lamp halos. The city seemed quieter than it was by day, not empty, but resting like a great animal curled up under a blanket of mist. As they passed the bookshop doorway, Matilda glanced at the closed window, at the sleeping spines behind the glass. Jack caught her look. "Books," he said, in a tone that suggested both affection and mild suspicion. "They sit there all night, thinking they know everything." Matilda smiled. "Do you dislike them?" "I wouldn't say dislike," Jack replied. "I'd say they're a bit smug, but some of them are kind. Mr. Fagin says every book is a house for somebody's thoughts, and thoughts deserve a roof, even if they're odd ones." "That is a very Fagin thing to say," Matilda murmured. Jack's grin returned, and the fog swallowed it and gave it back again. "You'll hear him say it yourself in a moment," he promised, and with that, they went on up through the lamplit mist, toward the warm spill of light that marked the doorway to a curiosity shop, where a hand-drawn map waited on a counter, and where a small, gentle errand was about to begin. The shop announced itself before you reached it, not with noise, but with light. A small window, set low in a soot-dark wall, shone honey-gold through the fog, and the glow did not spill sharply, so much as seep outward, turning the mist into something that looked almost drinkable. Above the door, a sign hand-painted long ago declared, in letters that had softened with age, that within could be found curiosities, small antiques, oddments, and useful things. The last words were squeezed in as if they had been added after a thoughtful pause. Jack Dawkins slowed and lifted a finger, as though he were about to introduce a person of consequence. "There," he said in a reverent whisper that was only half a jest. "Mr. Fagin's palace." Matilda's lantern flame shivered in a faint draught as she approached the door. A bell hung just inside, and when she pushed the handle down it gave a modest chime, neither shrill nor timid, but perfectly suited to a place that made room for all manner of arrivals. Warmth met her at once, warmth and the mingled scents of beeswax, old wood, and something faintly spiced, like cloves tucked into a drawer. The air inside was thick with lamplight. Several oil lamps burned at different heights, turning every brass hinge and glass jar into a small planet of reflection. The shop itself was narrow but deep, and it had the pleasant disorder of a place where objects were allowed to keep their stories. Shelves climbed the walls, crowded with tins, teapots, candlesticks, and boxes that looked as though they might contain anything from buttons to secrets. A line of umbrellas leaned in one corner like a gathering of tall, polite gentlemen. In another, a wicker basket held lengths of ribbon that spilled over the edge like coloured water. And at the centre, Behind a counter that was worn smooth by years of hands resting on it, sat Fagin. In kinder light, he looked less like the shadowed figure some might fear in harder tales, and more like an elderly magpie who had learned the difference between stealing and saving. His hair, thin and silvered, stood in wisps about his head, as if it had been startled into that position long ago and never quite settled again. Spectacles perched upon the end of his nose, and his eyes sharp as pins when they needed to be softened when they found Matilda, as if they recognized in her a fellow guardian of small comforts. Well, he said, his voice a warm rasp, like paper turned carefully. If it isn't Mrs. Crown, come in out o' the fog, my dear. Shut the door behind you, will you? The mist'll creep in and start browsing if we let it. Jack followed Matilda inside, pushing the door closed with a flourish, as though sealing them into a secret room. He gave Fagin a bow that was half respectful and half performance. Evening, sir, Jack said. I've delivered the lady safe as a banknote. Fagin waved a hand. Safe as a banknote, he repeated, amused. And about as quiet. You're a marvel, Jack, when you remember to be. Jack put a hand to his heart, offended with perfect cheer. I'm quiet as a mouse. I am a mouse with a trumpet, Fagin murmured, and his eyes crinkled. Matilda took off her gloves slowly, letting the warmth find her fingers. Oliver sent word, she said. He said you had something for me. Fagin's expression turned solemn, in the way of a man about to present a treasure. He reached beneath the counter and drew out a sheet of paper, folded carefully and held as though it might flutter away if treated casually. Ah, he said softly. Yes indeed. He placed it upon the counter and smoothed it with the flat of his hand. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed, and it carried the faint scent of smoke, as if it had lived near a hearth for a while. Lines in ink wandered across its streets, corners, little marks that might be buildings. There were tiny flourishes, a star here, a small spiral there, and near the bottom a careful drawing of a lamp with light drawn around it in a halo. Matilda leaned closer. It was a map, yes, but not the sort sold in tidy folds. This one had been made with tenderness. Each street name was written as if the writer wished the reader to find their way without shame. Ludgate Hill was there, and a thin line that indicated a narrow lane. The small chapel gatehouse alcove was marked with a tiny arch drawn lovingly, like a doorway in a child's picture. The bookshop doorway beneath the hissing gas lamp had a miniature rectangle and a little dot for the lamp itself, with wavy lines around it to suggest the hiss. And at last, in gentle, looping script, there was written, "The parlour by the hearth, knock twice, then once." Matilda felt her chest go tight in that warm way one feels when kindness appears unexpectedly. "You drew this," she said, though it was not truly a question. Fagin lifted his chin a little, pleased and pretending not to be. "Who else?" he said. "I've drawn maps before, you know. Maps to lost buttons, maps to misplaced spectacles, maps to the particular drawer where a person's patience has gone to hide. This one's the same, in a way, only bigger." Jack leaned over Matilda's shoulder. "He sat there doing it, muttering and squinting," Jack said, affectionate. "Like a poet with a headache." "Poets are always squinting," Fagin replied. "It's the thoughts too bright for 'em." Matilda traced the air above the paper, not touching it, as though her finger might disturb the ink's intention. "Who is it for?" she asked gently. Fagin's gaze dropped to the map, and for a moment his cleverness looked like something softer, like concern wearing an old coat. "A fellow," he said. "A man from out of town, come in shiverin' and polite. The sort who says, 'Thank you,' too quickly, as if he expects the offer to be taken back. He asked for a place to rest, quiet, warm, not dear. I told him of Mrs. Pinner's house, and of you, and of the parlour that smells of tea even when there's none brewed." Matilda's eyes warmed. "That is kind of you." Fagin made a little dismissive sound. "It ain't kind," he said. "It's practical. A man needs a roof. London's no place to sleep with the sky for a blanket, not in January." Jack's grin faded into something more earnest. "He didn't take it," Jack reminded. "No," Fagin said, and his voice was quieter. "He didn't. He stood right there where you're standing now, Mrs. Crown, and he looked at the map like it was a fine thing he'd no right to touch. Then he said he wouldn't trouble anyone, wouldn't impose, wouldn't be a burden. And out he went, into the fog, with his shoulders up around his ears like he was trying to hide inside himself. Matilda looked down at the map again, at the gentle instruction to knock twice, then once. She imagined a hand hesitating before a door, not because the door was frightening, but because hope can be a heavy thing when you're tired. "Where did he go?" she asked. Fagin tapped a finger on the map near the small arch drawing. "He asked after the chapel," he said. "Said he'd seen a little gatehouse alcove when he came in. Said the stone looked dry enough to lean against, and there was a draught of candle scent. He thought perhaps he could rest there a while without disturbing a soul." Matilda's throat tightened again. "That chapel gatehouse," she murmured. "It has a small recess, doesn't it? Like a cupped hand." "A cupped hand," Fagin echoed, pleased by the phrasing. Yes, exactly. But it's cold stone, Mrs. Crown. Stone don't hold warmth the way a room does." Matilda's gaze lifted to Fagin's face. "You want me to bring him in?" she said softly. Fagin's eyes shone behind his spectacles. "I do," he admitted, "and I think you can. You've got a way, you have, of offering warmth like it's the most ordinary thing in the world. Makes it easier for folk to accept." Jack cleared his throat as if he had something important to contribute. "And I can show you the quickest way," he said at once. "I'm full of usefulness tonight." Fagin pointed at him with mock severity. "You're full of something, that's certain," he said. Then his tone gentled. "Go on then, both of you. Take the map. Take it as if it's always belonged to the person who needs it." Matilda folded the paper carefully, feeling its thickness, the slight raised texture where the ink sat. She tucked it into the inside pocket of her cloak, close to her chest. "I will try," she said. Fagin reached beneath the counter again and produced a small object, a tin cup, dented but clean, with a handle that had been repaired with a twist of wire. He held it out. "And take this," he said. "There's tea in the pot still warm. Not fancy, but it'll do a body good." Matilda hesitated. "Mr. Fagin," he wagged a finger. "No refusals," he said. "If you don't take it, I'll drink it myself, and then I'll be up all night talking." Jack made a face. "Spare us," he begged. Matilda accepted the cup with both hands, smiling. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." Fagin leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence with the lamplight itself. "And Mrs. Crown," he added, "if you find him, and he looks at you like you're offering him the moon, tell him it's only a chair by the fire. Tell him chairs were made to be sat in, and fires were made to be shared." Matilda's eyes stung, though she blinked it away gently. They left the shop with the bell chiming softly behind them, and the fog welcomed them back with its quiet hand. The warmth of the tin cup pressed through Matilda's gloves, and she held it close, as though carrying a small piece of hearth into the street. Jack took the lead, turning them down a narrower lane where the buildings leaned close enough to share secrets. The gas lamps here were fewer, but each one glowed like a watchful eye, and the fog turned their light into floating gold. "Chapel's not far," Jack said, keeping his voice low, as if the night was sleeping and ought not be woken. "And don't you worry, Mrs. Crown. If he's there, we'll coax him out gentle as you please. No fuss." Matilda walked steadily, her breath making a small cloud that vanished almost at once. "It isn't fuss I worry about," she said. "It's pride." Jack nodded as if he understood far more than his grin suggested. "Pride's a funny thing," he said. "Makes a man refuse a blanket because he thinks it's a net. But you don't throw blankets like nets. You lay 'em down like welcome." The lane opened onto a small square, quiet in the winter night. Here the fog seemed to pause, as if respecting the stone walls that enclosed the space. A chapel stood on one side, modest, old, its windows tall and dark. Beside its main gate was the little gatehouse, and in the gatehouse wall, just as Fagin had marked, was a shallow alcove, a recess carved into stone, sheltered from the wind by an arch. A candle burned somewhere nearby, perhaps inside the gatehouse, perhaps set in a small lantern by the chapel door, casting a weak, steady glow that made the stone look almost warm. Matilda slowed. At first she saw only shadow within the alcove, a shape that might have been a bundle of coats. Then the shadow shifted, and she realized it was a man, seated low, shoulders hunched, his hat pulled down, as though he wished to disappear into the stone. Jack, for all his confidence, did not stride forward. He approached with care, giving the man the dignity of not being startled. "Evening," Jack said softly, as if speaking to someone in a sick room. "Cold spot you've chosen." The man's head lifted. His face emerged into the candle's reach, pale with fatigue, eyes wary not with suspicion but with shame. He was not young, perhaps in his 30s or 40s, with stubble along his jaw and the look of someone who had been thinking too hard for too long. His coat was decent but travel-worn, and his boots carried the dust of roads beyond London. "I'm not doing any harm," the man said quickly, his voice hoarse. "I'll be gone before morning. There was shelter here, and I thought—" Matilda stepped forward then, not too close, but close enough that the warmth from the tin cup might reach him in suggestion, if not in truth. "You're doing no harm at all," she said, her voice calm as a quilt being smoothed. "You've chosen a quiet place, but it's still stone, and stone doesn't care for cold. People do." The man stared at her, blinking as though he hadn't expected the night to answer him. "I don't want trouble," he murmured. "No trouble," Matilda agreed. "Only tea, perhaps, and a place to sit where the air doesn't bite." She lifted the tin cup slightly. The faint scent of tea rose up, delicate but real. The man's gaze fixed on it as if it were a memory. "That's very kind," he said, and the words came out like something he'd been taught but hadn't used in some time. Jack leaned a shoulder against the gatehouse wall, adopting a casual posture that was meant to make the moment feel ordinary. "Mr. Fagin sends his regards," he said lightly, "and he sends his tea, which between us is not his best quality, but it's warm." The man's eyes widened at the name, though not with fear, more with recognition. "You did," Matilda said. "He was concerned for you." The man's shoulders tightened. "He offered me help," he admitted. "And I couldn't." Matilda did not press him. She simply nodded, as though this were a thing she had heard before and would hear again, and that it did not make her think less of him. "It can be difficult," she said, "to accept warmth when you've been cold a long while. It feels strange, like it belongs to someone else." The man swallowed. His breath made a small cloud in the alcove's darkness. "I've come to London for work," he said, as if explaining himself to the stone. "A clerk's position, if I can find it. I had a letter, but the man I was to meet—" "He's gone to Bristol," they told me, "and I've no address. I've walked all day. I thought I'd find lodging easily enough, but every door seemed like it belonged to someone who knew how to belong." Matilda's heart ached in the gentlest way, not sharp, but deep. She imagined him standing beneath gas lamps, watching windows lit from within, hearing laughter muffled by curtains, feeling like an outsider peering into a life that might never open. She reached into her cloak and drew out the folded map. "This belongs to you," she said. The man's eyes fixed on the paper, and his face tightened as if bracing for disappointment. "I didn't take it," he whispered. Matilda held it out, not forcing it into his hand, simply offering it as one might offer a chair. "Then take it now," she said. "Not because you must, because it's useful. Mr. Fagin drew it so you wouldn't have to guess, and I've come to show you that the place it leads to is real." The man stared at her for a long moment. Jack said nothing. Even the fog seemed to pause, listening. At last, slowly, the man reached out. His fingers were stiff with cold. When they touched the paper, they trembled slightly, and Matilda saw, in that tremble, how close he had been to giving up on warmth entirely. He unfolded the map awkwardly, as though afraid to crease it. The candlelight caught the ink. His eyes moved over the lines, the little drawings, the gentle instruction about the knock. His throat worked. "This is—" he began, and then stopped, as if words were too clumsy for what he felt. "It's a route," Jack said, softly proud. "A guided route, you might say. Very fashionable." The man gave a breath that might have been a laugh, might have been a sob made polite. "I don't know your names," he said, looking between them. "Matilda Crown," Matilda replied. "And this is Jack Dawkins." "The Artful Dodger," Jack added at once, tipping his cap. "But only in reputation these days. Mostly I'm a guide to lampposts and decent tea." The man's mouth twitched. He began, then hesitated, as though even his name might be too much to offer. "My name is Samuel," he said finally. "Samuel Harker." "Mr. Harker," Matilda said, letting the title give him dignity like a coat. "Will you come with us?" Samuel's gaze dropped to his boots, to the stone beneath him. "I don't have much," he said quietly. "I can pay a little, when I find work. But Matilda held up a hand, not to stop him, but to soothe him. "Mrs. Pinner will speak with you about coins," she said. "That's her talent. and she does it well. My talent is making tea and keeping the fire steady. Let us begin with that, and let tomorrow deal with tomorrow." Samuel's eyes lifted, searching her face as though looking for the hidden cost. What he found there, only steady kindness, seemed to make him both relieved and afraid. Jack pushed gently, with humour as his lever. "Besides," he said, "if you stay here, you'll wake up with your nose frozen solid, and then you'll have to go about London sounding like a trumpet. No one wants that." Samuel gave that small, polite laugh again, and it loosened something in his shoulders. He rose slowly from the alcove, joints stiff, coat creased from his time against the stone. Matilda stepped closer and held the tin cup out to him. "Drink," she said simply. Samuel took it with both hands, as though afraid it might disappear. He sipped. His eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them again, they looked less haunted. "Thank you," he whispered. Matilda nodded. "Come," she said. They walked back through the square, the chapel behind them, its dark windows watching quietly. The fog thickened again as they re-entered the lanes, and the gas lamps turned the world into a series of soft-lit scenes, each one gently dissolving into the next. Jack kept up a low stream of commentary, not loud, not demanding attention, but enough to keep Samuel from falling into the heavy silence of his own worries. "That lamp there," Jack murmured as they passed one, "always hisses like it's telling secrets. And that shop window, see it? That one's got a cat in it every night, sitting like it owns the glass. If you ever feel uncertain, follow the cat. Cats always know where the warmest spot is." Samuel listened, and Matilda could see him beginning, inch by inch, to return to the world. At the narrow bookshop doorway beneath the hissing gas lamp, Jack slowed. "There," he said, pointing with a flourish that was softened by real care. "That's on your map, Mr. Harker. That doorway, the lamp that sings. You're doing it already. You're on the route." Samuel glanced at the map in his hands, then up at the doorway. The lamp's hiss made a steady thread of sound, and the fog turned its light into a halo that seemed to rest on Samuel's shoulders for a moment, as if blessing him. "I thought it was only a drawing," he said quietly. "I thought perhaps it was meant as a kindness, but not a real one." Matilda walked beside him, her steps even. "Kindness is real," she said. "It can be drawn on paper, yes, but it must also have somewhere to go." Samuel looked at her then, and his eyes shone. They continued up Ludgate Hill, the incline gentle but persistent. Matilda felt the familiar satisfaction of walking with purpose, not hurried, but sure. She had the sense of carrying not only Samuel, but the idea of home itself, guiding it back toward the parlour where it could settle. As they approached the boarding-house street, a figure appeared ahead, moving through the fog with a careful steadiness. Oliver. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth, perhaps the missing teapot lid, perhaps some other rescued object, and when he saw them, his face brightened with quiet relief. "Mrs. Crown," he said, stepping close. His gaze moved to Samuel, and there was no judgment in it, only welcome. "You found him." Matilda nodded. "Oliver," she said softly, "this is Mr. Samuel Harker." Oliver offered his hand at once, as naturally as if he were greeting a neighbour at a garden gate rather than a tired stranger in a fog-bound street. "Good evening, Mr. Harker," he said. "It's cold out. You'll be glad of the fire." Samuel hesitated, then took the hand. His grip was weak with fatigue, but his eyes held gratitude. "You're very kind," he murmured. Oliver's smile was gentle. "People have been kind to me," he said simply. "It's only right to pass it along." Jack made a soft noise of approval. "Listen to that," he said. "He speaks like a book. He does." Oliver glanced at Jack with affectionate exasperation. "And you speak like a weather vane," he replied, "always turning to whatever makes you laugh." Jack bowed. "Laughter's a fine compass," he declared. Matilda watched them, warmth spreading in her chest, not from tea now, but from the sight of these three, each with their own history, their own sorrows, their own ways of surviving, standing together under gaslight as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Come," she said again, and now the word felt like a door opening. They reached the boarding house. The lion-faced knocker caught the lamplight, solemn and patient. Samuel stood before the door as if facing a threshold, not only of wood and brick, but of possibility. Matilda took the map gently from his hands and folded it once more. "You'll keep it," she said. "But first let's do what it says." She raised her hand and knocked. Twice, then once. The sound echoed softly through the entryway beyond, and the house seemed to inhale. A moment later, the door opened, and Mrs. Pinner appeared round-faced, cap slightly askew, candle in hand. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Mrs. Crown," she said, then looked past her. "And who's this, then?" Matilda stepped aside so Samuel could be seen in the candlelight, tired, travel-worn, but standing straighter than he had in the chapel alcove. "This is Mr. Samuel Harker," Matilda said. "He's come in from out of town. He needs a warm room and a quiet night." Mrs. Pinner's gaze travelled over him with the practiced assessment of a woman who could judge character by how someone held their hat. Samuel held his hat respectfully, not wringing it, not clutching it defensively, simply holding it, as if he understood manners even when he had little else. Mrs. Pinner made a small sound that might have been approval. "Well," she said briskly, though her candle hand did not waver, "you'd best come in out of that fog, Mr. Harker, before it decides to move in with you. Crowns kept the parlour fire going, and there's tea if you've a mind for it." Samuel blinked, and Matilda saw the moment his belief shifted, when the map stopped being a hopeful drawing and became a real corridor of warmth. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. "Thank you very much." Mrs. Pinner sniffed, but it was a softened sniff. "Yes, yes," she said, waving him in as if gratitude were a coat to be hung up later. "Come along." They entered the house, and at once the cold fell away in layers, fog left at the threshold, wind left in the entry, winter left outside the parlour door. Inside the parlour, the hearth glowed steadily, and the waiting chair sat exactly as Matilda had left it, blanket folded over the back, like an embrace prepared in advance. The biscuits waited beneath their cloth. Samuel stopped in the doorway, staring as though he had walked into a memory of home he thought he'd misplaced. Matilda moved gently, guiding him not with hands but with presence. "Here," she said softly. "Sit by the fire." Samuel approached the chair as if it might vanish. He lowered himself into it slowly, and when the blanket brushed his shoulders, he flinched, then exhaled, as though his body had been holding its breath for hours. Oliver stepped quietly to the kettle, as if he had always belonged to this room. "Shall I pour?" he asked Matilda. "Yes, please," she replied. Jack hovered near the mantel, warming his hands and pretending he wasn't. "I'll take a biscuit," he announced loudly, as if claiming it for the sake of manners. "For the road. For the sake of my stamina." Mrs. Pinner's mouth twitched. "Only one," she said, "and don't you drop crumbs like a trail. We've no need of mice finding their way here." Jack clutched his chest again. "Madam," he said, scandalized, "I would never invite guests without permission." Matilda set a cup of tea into Samuel's hands, this time poured into a proper cup, not the tin. The steam rose, fragrant and kind. Samuel held it as if it were the first warm thing he had touched in days. "I don't know how to—" he began, and his voice broke slightly. He swallowed and tried again. "I don't know how to accept this." Matilda sat in her own chair, turning slightly so she faced him without crowding him. The firelight warmed her cheek. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "You're here. That's enough." Samuel stared into his tea, and for a moment the only sound was the clock ticking and the coals settling in the grate. Then, quietly, Samuel spoke, as if confessing to the warmth itself. "I thought," he said, "that if I came to London, I'd become someone. Not grand, only steady. I thought I'd find my place in a week, perhaps 2. But the city," he shook his head faintly, "it's so full of people who already know where they belong." Oliver's voice was gentle, almost a murmur. "It can feel that way," he said, "but belonging isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just—" A chair kept near the fire. Jack nodded, surprisingly serious. "And a map," he added. "Maps help." Samuel's fingers tightened around his cup. "When Mr. Fagin offered me the map," he said, "I felt ashamed, as if I'd failed before I'd begun, as if needing help meant I didn't deserve to be here." Matilda's gaze softened. "Needing help is not failing," she said. "It's being human, and London is full of humans. It has to make room for that." Samuel looked up, and the firelight caught the wetness in his eyes. He blinked it away quickly, but Matilda did not pretend not to see. She simply let it be, as naturally as steam. Mrs. Pinner cleared her throat, perhaps to keep herself from becoming too tender in front of strangers. "Well," she said briskly. "I've a small room at the top. Not the biggest, but it's got a decent view of the chimneys, and the bed's sound. We can talk payment in the morning when you've slept. Tonight, you'll have your tea and warm yourself, and that's that." Samuel's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "I thank you," he managed. Mrs. Pinner waved the thanks away as if brushing flour from her hands. "Eat a biscuit," she commanded, pushing the plate toward him. "Thin men catch cold." Jack leaned toward Matilda and whispered theatrically, "See? Kind as Christmas pudding she is." Matilda hid a smile behind her cup. Oliver settled on the edge of a chair, his posture relaxed, his presence calm as a steady flame. "Mr. Fagin will be glad," he said to Samuel. "He worries sometimes, though he tries to hide it under jokes." Samuel looked at the folded map resting on the table now, and his expression shifted into something like awe. "He drew it for me," he said softly. "A stranger." Oliver nodded. "He likes to collect things," he said. "But lately, he's been collecting." Jack grinned again, the levity returning like a familiar coat. "He's gone sentimental," he announced. "It'll be the end of him." Matilda let the conversation flow gently, like tea poured slow. She watched Samuel's shoulders lower, watched his hands stop trembling as the warmth reached him properly. She listened to the clock, to the fire, to the small human sounds of people in a room where they were safe. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, but it felt distant now, like weather beyond a thick curtain. When Samuel had finished his tea, he sat back and closed his eyes for a moment, as if testing what it felt like to rest without fear. Matilda's longing quiet, steady eased. Not vanished, not solved forever, but soothed, as if a knot had loosened. She looked toward Oliver and Jack, and in her mind she saw Fagin behind his counter, lamplit, spectacles low, drawing street names like charms. She imagined him waiting for news, pretending he wasn't. "We should tell Mr. Fagin," Matilda said softly. Jack popped the last bit of biscuit into his mouth and brushed his hands together. "I'll do it," he said at once. "I'm a messenger by nature. Besides, he'll give me a sweet if I return triumphant." Oliver rose too. "I'll come with you," he said. "He'll be pleased to hear it from both of us." Matilda nodded. "Thank you," she murmured. Jack tipped his cap to Samuel. "Rest up, Mr. Harker," he said. "London looks different after a proper sleep, less like a beast, more like a blanket." Samuel managed a small smile. "Good night," he said, and the words sounded as though he meant them. Oliver offered Samuel a gentle nod, then turned to Matilda. "Will you be all right?" he asked quietly. Matilda's eyes warmed. "Yes," she said. "This is what I know how to do." Oliver's smile was soft. "Then good night, Mrs. Crown." When the boys had gone, Mrs. Pinner busied herself with practical kindness, fetching a candle stub for Samuel's room, directing him up the stairs with brisk instructions that somehow felt comforting rather than strict. Matilda remained in the parlour, tending the fire, straightening the cloth, moving with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has helped a small piece of the world settle into place. And as the house grew still again, stairs quiet, doors closed, voices faded, Matilda sat once more in her chair, the hearth warmth steady on her cheek. Outside, fog and gaslight continued their slow dance along Ludgate Hill, turning the city into soft shapes and gentled edges. Inside, the boarding house held its warmth like a promise kept. Matilda let her hands rest in her lap, and for a moment she simply listened to the clock and the fire, and felt, in the calm of the room, that homecoming was sometimes nothing more dramatic than a map accepted, a door opened, and a chair by the hearth waiting as though it had always been meant for you. The boarding house settled into its deeper quiet as the night progressed. In the parlour, the fire's voice lowered from crackle to murmur, and the embers drew themselves closer together like friends leaning in. The clock on the mantel ticked with the unhurried confidence of something that had been counting minutes long before any of them arrived, and would go on counting them long after. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, not the sound of mischief, only the house stretching itself in sleep. Matilda did not rise at once to go to her own room. She sat a little longer, letting the warmth soak into her bones, and letting her thoughts move slowly, as though they were also warming. Now and then, she glanced toward the doorway, not expecting anyone to enter, yet not wanting to be startled if they did. She knew how new sleep could be, when a person had been cold and anxious, how it could break like thin ice, leaving someone awake and uncertain in the dark. At last, she stood, banked the fire with a careful hand, and carried the kettle to the kitchen so it could be filled for the morning. She moved quietly through the hall, the candle in her hand making pale gold pools on the wallpaper, and the fog's shadow pressing faintly against the front door as if listening. When she returned, the parlour was exactly as she had left it, except for one small change. Samuel Harker sat in the chair by the hearth, awake. He was not fully upright, not alert as if ready to flee. He sat with his shoulders rounded, hands clasped loosely, staring into the dim red heart of the coals as though it were a map of its own. The blanket remained around him, and his boots were off placed neatly by the fender like a small, sincere sign that he meant to stay. Matilda paused in the doorway. "I'm sorry," Samuel said at once, hearing her. His voice was low, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to. I woke, and couldn't quite settle again." "You needn't apologize," Matilda replied, stepping in gently. "Sometimes the body is slower than the mind when it comes to believing it's safe." Samuel's gaze dropped to his hands. "It's foolish," he murmured. "A chair, a fire, a roof, and still my thoughts keep walking, as if they're afraid to stop." Matilda crossed to the sideboard and lifted the cloth from the biscuits. She took one and set it on a small plate, then poured a little more tea from the pot into a cup, warming the cup first with a splash to chase away the chill. "It isn't foolish," she said, bringing the cup to him. "It's habit, and habit can be coaxed into new ways, the same as a cat can be coaxed into a different chair." Samuel accepted the cup with both hands. The steam rose and brushed his face. His eyes closed briefly. "It tastes like—" he began, then shook his head faintly, as if the comparison was too personal to speak aloud. "Like what?" Matilda asked softly, sitting in her own chair. Samuel opened his eyes, and the firelight made them look warmer than before. "Like my mother's kitchen. When I was a boy, she'd keep a small pot on the range, always something. Tea, broth, hot water for washing. She said warmth was a kind of order. It kept things from falling apart." Matilda felt a gentle ache of recognition. "She was wise," she said. Samuel looked into his tea again. "When she died," he said, "the house felt large, not in size but in silence. I left not long after. I thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't feel it." He gave a slow breath. "I've been moving a long time." Matilda watched him with the steady compassion of someone who understood that grief could be quiet as dust, settling into corners. "You may rest here," she said, "even if only for tonight, even if only for a few hours at a time." Samuel's fingers tightened on the cup. "It's strange," he whispered, "how hard it is to accept." Matilda's gaze went, briefly, to the folded, hand-drawn map on the table, placed there like a small blessing. "Perhaps you might practice with something simpler," she said. "Accept the tea, accept the heat, accept the fact that the clock will go on ticking whether you keep watch over it or not." Samuel's mouth quirked. "The clock seems reliable," he admitted. "It is," Matilda said. "And so are you, I expect. Only you've been asked to be reliable alone." Samuel looked at her then, and something in his face softened further like a knot loosened by warm water. "Thank you," he said again, but this time the words did not sound like a reflex. They sounded like a true arrival. Matilda nodded, letting the gratitude settle without fuss. "Finish your tea," she said, "then try again. If sleep comes, let it. If it doesn't, sit and listen to the fire until your thoughts grow tired of walking." Samuel did as she suggested. When his cup was empty, he set it down carefully, as though not wanting to disturb the room's calm. He sat a moment longer, then rose. "I'll try," he said, voice softer. Matilda stood too, and walked with him into the hall. The stairs creaked gently as he climbed, and the candlelight followed him like a kind escort. When his door closed, the sound was not a shutting out but a settling in. Matilda returned to the parlour, and for a little while she sat alone, listening to the embers and the clock. Outside, the fog still held Ludgate Hill in its quiet embrace. Inside, the boarding house had made space for one more breathing body, one more tired heart. At last, Matilda rose and went to bed, and sleep came to her with the familiar softness of an old shawl. Morning arrived slowly, as winter mornings do. There was no bright, sudden dawn. Instead, the darkness thinned into a pewter grey, and the fog turned from midnight velvet to something pale and milky. The gas lamps outside burned a little longer than usual, their halos faint in the growing light, like dreams that hadn't quite left. Matilda woke to the sound of the kitchen below, the kettle beginning its patient hum, Mrs. Pinner's brisk footsteps, the clink of a spoon against a pot. The house smelled faintly of toast and coal smoke and the promise of tea. She dressed quietly, pinning her hair with practiced hands, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders. When she stepped into the hall, she heard a door open upstairs and careful footsteps. Samuel appeared at the top of the stairs, looking as though he'd slept perhaps not deeply, perhaps not long, but enough to ease the harshest lines from his face. He had washed, too. His hair was damp, combed back, and his collar was straight. He carried himself with more steadiness, as if warmth had returned his bones to him. "Good morning," Matilda said. Samuel paused as though uncertain of the proper distance between himself and kindness. "Good morning, Mrs. Crown," he replied, voice respectful. Then, after a breath, "I slept. In pieces, but I slept." "That is a good beginning," Matilda said. Mrs. Pinner called up from below, as if she'd been listening the whole time. "If you're both going to stand about admiring the staircase, do it with a cup of tea in your hands. Breakfast." Samuel blinked, then gave the smallest smile. "She is direct," he murmured. "She is," Matilda agreed, with fondness. "It is one of her virtues." In the kitchen, Mrs. Pinner set plates down with brisk competence. There was porridge, steaming and plain, with a small bowl of treacle for those who liked sweetness. There were slices of toast and a pat of butter softening near the range. The kettle sang. Samuel ate as though he had forgotten what it felt like to be fed without having to bargain for it. Matilda watched him without staring, pleased by each steady spoonful, each sip of tea taken without apology. When breakfast was done, Mrs. Pinner wiped her hands on her apron and fixed Samuel with her practical gaze. "Now," she said, "you said you came for work. A clerk's position, was it?" Samuel's shoulders stiffened, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I had a letter of introduction, but the man I was to meet has gone away." Mrs. Pinner sniffed. "Men are forever going away," she declared, as if it were a personal inconvenience. "Well, London's full of work if you know where to look, and if you don't, you find someone who does." Her eyes flicked to Matilda. Matilda understood at once. Not that she herself knew every office and ledger in the city, but that she knew people who knew people, and kindness often travelled through such chains. "There is a bookshop not far," Matilda said gently, turning to Samuel. "The one beneath the hissing gas lamp. Sometimes they keep notices in the window positions, rooms, small advertisements, and Mr. Fagin's shop, he hears things. News travels to him like sparrows." Samuel hesitated. "I don't wish to trouble." Mrs. Pinner cut him off with a look sharp enough to slice bread. "If you say trouble one more time, I'll charge you for it," she said. "Go look. Come back with information at least. Information's useful." Samuel's mouth opened, then closed again. "Yes, ma'am," he said, subdued. Matilda rose and fetched her gloves. "I will walk with you," she said. "Not because you cannot walk alone, but because the morning fog can be confusing, and it's kinder to go together." Samuel's eyes warmed, and he nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. Before they left, Matilda took the hand-drawn map from the parlour table and slipped it into Samuel's pocket herself, gently, as if tucking in a child's blanket. "You may not need it in daylight," she said, "but it seems to like being with you." Samuel's hand touched his pocket instinctively. "It does," he murmured. "It feels steady." They stepped out into the morning. The fog still lingered, but it was thinner now, and the city's sounds were waking. A distant cart, the clipped hooves of a horse, a vendor calling softly from somewhere down the street. The gas lamps were being put out one by a lamplighter moving like a quiet conductor, snuffing each flame with a practiced hand. As they approached the corner, a familiar figure leaned against the narrow bookshop doorway beneath the hissing gas lamp, as if the lamp and he had an arrangement. Jack Dawkins appeared as though conjured by habit. His cap was tilted, his coat buttoned, his grin already prepared. "Morning," he declared, far too cheerfully for winter. "If it isn't Mrs. Crown and our gentleman of the map." Samuel looked startled. "You're here," he said. Jack spread his hands. "Of course I'm here," he said. "This is my post. I keep an eye on the lamp, make sure it doesn't wander off." The lamp hissed, as if offended. "And you," Jack said, pointing at Samuel with mock severity, "you look less like a ghost today. That's an improvement. We don't want you floating about scaring respectable pigeons. Samuel's mouth twitched. I slept, he admitted. Jack clapped his hands softly, as if applauding a fine performance. There you are then. London's far kinder when you've had sleep. Shall we see what the bookshop's got for you? Matilda glanced at the shop window. Inside, books sat in neat ranks, their spines dark and dignified. A small notice board was indeed visible beyond them, pinned with paper squares. The door opened before Matilda could knock, and a man with ink-stained fingers and a cardigan that had seen many winters peered out. Mrs. Crown, he said, recognition warming his voice. You're up early. Mr. Brierly, Matilda replied with a gentle smile. Good morning. Mr. Anselm Brierly was the sort of bookseller who looked as though he might be made of paper and patience. His hair was grey and soft, his spectacles slightly smudged, and when he spoke, he did so as if each word were being placed carefully onto a shelf. Jack tipped his cap. Morning, sir, he said, unusually polite. We're here on serious business. Mr. Brierly's brows rose. Serious business in Jack Dawkins' company? The world is indeed changing. Jack put a hand to his heart. I am a man of gravity, he protested. Matilda introduced Samuel, and Mr. Brierly's gaze softened at once. He had the keen kindness of someone who had watched many lonely people find companionship in pages. A clerk's position, Mr. Brierly mused, stepping aside to let them in. Well, let's see what the city has pinned up for you. Inside, the shop smelled of dust and leather and faint, comforting damp the smell of old stories and warm hands. The hissing gas lamp outside became a softer sound through the glass, and the morning fog made the window light diffuse and gentle. Mr. Brierly led them to the notice board. Several papers were pinned there. A request for a seamstress, an advertisement for a lost terrier, a notice about a choir rehearsal at the chapel, and, near the bottom, a small sheet written in neat script. Clerk required. Light ledger work, respectable hours. Apply at Hawthorne and Wick. Stationers and printers, Fleet Street. Samuel leaned in as if the paper might vanish if he blinked. Fleet Street, he whispered. Jack groaned theatrically. Fleet Street, he repeated, as though the words tasted of ink. Matilda smiled faintly. It is not so terrible, she said, repeating her earlier sentiment. Mr. Brierly tapped the paper with an ink-stained finger. Hawthorne and Wick are decent folk, he said. They supply half the small shops in the area. They're always needing someone with steady hands and a steady mind. Samuel swallowed. I can do ledger work, he said. I've done it before. Mr. Brierly studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then go, he said. Not today. Perhaps today you might still be thawing, but soon. And take this. He disappeared into the back and returned with a small card clean, thick paper with a name written on it. Ask for Mr. Wick, he said. Tell him I sent you. He owes me a favour. He once returned a book late, and I have never let him forget it. Jack leaned towards Samuel, whispering loudly, That's how you do business in London, remember everyone's sins, and use 'em polite. Mr. Brierly's mouth quirked. Exactly. Samuel held the card as though it were another map, one that led not only to a building, but to a future. His eyes lifted to Matilda, and his voice was quiet. Thank you, he said. I would not have found this on my own. Matilda touched his arm lightly. Sometimes finding is easier when you're not alone, she said. Jack, perhaps sensing that the moment was growing too tender for his taste, cleared his throat. And now, he declared, I insist we go tell Mr. Fagin. He'll want to know his map has produced results. He's terribly proud of that map, you know. If it could talk, it'd boast. Mr. Brierly gave a small laugh. Go on then, he said. And if you pass the chapel, tell the verger I've still got his hymn book. He left it here again. Matilda promised she would, and together they stepped back into the fog-soft morning, Samuel with a printer's card in his pocket and a hand-drawn map pressed close to his heart, and the city around them beginning very gently to feel less like a maze and more like a place where roots could be drawn in kindness. They turned from the bookshop and followed the familiar slope of Ludgate Hill, the morning fog drifting in pale ribbons between the buildings, as though the city were still half asleep. Samuel walked differently now, not boldly, not as though the streets belonged to him, but with a steadier rhythm, his shoulders less hunched, his gaze lifting to the signs and windows rather than fixing always on the pavement. Every so often his fingers touched the edge of the card in his pocket, checking that it was still there, as if reassurance could be felt through paper. Jack, naturally, noticed everything. "He's got the look," Jack announced, strolling a half-step ahead, as if he were leading a parade. "That's the look of a man who's about to become respectable. It's dangerous. Next thing you know, you'll be buying a proper hat." Samuel's mouth twitched. "I already own a proper hat," he said, patting the one on his head as if defending it. Jack leaned close, stage whispering to Matilda. "He says that now. Wait until he's got wages and starts thinking about felt. Felt turns a man's mind." Matilda smiled, enjoying the easy manner Samuel had begun to show small smiles, quiet acknowledgements, the simple act of answering without flinching. Oliver walked beside Matilda, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, as though he had all the time in the world and wished to spend it kindly. "You'll go to Fleet Street soon?" Oliver asked Samuel gently. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Tomorrow," he said, then hesitated. "If that isn't too eager." Oliver shook his head. "It isn't eager," he said. "It's hopeful." Samuel swallowed, and Matilda saw the word hopeful land in him with a quiet weight, not as something he had to defend, but as something he might allow. They reached the glow of Fagin's window again, and though it was morning, the shop's lamplight still burned within less necessary now than it had been at midnight, yet kept alive as if the place refused to be ordinary just because the sun had chosen to wake. Jack pushed the door open with the same flourish as before, and the bell chimed with its modest little voice. Inside, the warmth and scent of beeswax met them like a familiar coat. The lamps were turned lower, but the shop remained a kingdom of glimmer and story tin boxes with painted lids, brass knobs, strings of beads, stacks of old newspapers tied with twine. Fagin appeared from behind the counter at once, as though he had been standing there all along, pretending he wasn't waiting. "Well?" he demanded, eyes bright behind his spectacles. Well, don't stand there like a row of lampposts. Speak." Jack spread his arms as if delivering a grand proclamation. "We return victorious," he declared. "We have retrieved the man from the stone alcove and delivered him to the hearth like a parcel of rare quality." Fagin's gaze flew to Samuel, and in that instant, the old man's cleverness softened entirely into relief. "Ah," he breathed, and his voice lost its rasp for a moment. "There you are, my boy." Samuel stood awkwardly, as if uncertain where to put his hands, then removed his hat. His cheeks coloured. "Mr. Fagin," he said quietly, I wanted to thank you." Fagin waved a hand so briskly it nearly knocked over a jar of buttons. "Thank me by breath in," he said. "Thank me by keeping warm. That's all the thanks a body needs." Samuel's eyes flicked toward Matilda and Oliver, then back. "Your map," he said, touching his pocket where it rested. "It was—" He stopped, as if words were too rough for something tender. "It was more than ink," he finished, in a low voice. Fagin made a small sound, half sniff and half chuckle, as if he disliked being caught in sincerity. "Ink's always more than ink," he muttered. "Ink's how folk talk to each other across distances, across time, across stubbornness." Jack leaned on the counter, grinning. "He's proud," he announced. "Don't let him deny it." "I'm not proud," Fagin protested. "I'm practical." Oliver smiled. "You're both," he said kindly. Samuel glanced around the shop, taking in its crowded comfort. "I went to the bookshop this morning," he said, voice steadier. "Mr. Brierly showed me a notice. A clerk's position. Fleet Street." Fagin's head jerked up, alert as a sparrow. "Fleet Street?" he repeated. "Stationers and printers?" Samuel nodded. "Hawthorne and Wick," he said. "Mr. Brierly gave me a card. He said to ask for Mr. Wick." Fagin gave a satisfied little nod, as if a puzzle piece had clicked. "I know him," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne's got hands always stained with ink, and Mr. Wick's got a temper like a kettle quick to whistle, quick to settle again. But they're fair. Fairer than some." Matilda watched Samuel's face soften with each confirmation, as though the city's maze were becoming a route marked in gentle ink. Fagin peered at Samuel over his spectacles. "And you'll go?" he said, not asking. "Yes," Samuel replied, then drew a careful breath. "Tomorrow." "Good," Fagin said briskly. Now stand here a moment." He disappeared beneath the counter and produced a small notebook plain, brown cover, the edges slightly worn. He set it down in front of Samuel. "What's that?" Samuel asked, startled. "A ledger," Fagin said grandly. Or a journal, or a list of reasons to keep going when your mind gets foolish. It's whatever you need it to be. Pages are patient. They'll hold what you can't. Samuel stared at it, as if afraid it might come with a condition. Fagin huffed. It's empty, he said. No one's put any sins in it yet. Take it. Matilda felt her throat tighten again, warmed by the sight of Fagin's kindness disguised as briskness, Jack's humour used like a cushion, Oliver's calm presence like steady fire. Samuel's fingers hovered, then touched the notebook. He looked up at Fagin. I can't, Jack cut in at once, as if swatting away the word before it could sting. Yes, you can, he said brightly. It's a notebook, not a piano. It won't bite. Samuel let out a small laugh, and the laugh seemed to loosen his hand. He lifted the notebook, holding it gently. Thank you, he said again, and this time his voice sounded less afraid of gratitude. Fagin nodded briskly, then turned his gaze on Matilda. And you, he said, wagging a finger. Mrs. Crown, how's your parlour? Still smellin' of tea and decency? It does, Matilda replied. And now it has one more person breathing in it. Good, Fagin said, satisfied. Then he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice in a conspiratorial tone that made even the jars of buttons seem to listen. Now, I've been thinking, Jack groaned. Here it comes. Fagin ignored him. A map's a fine thing, he said. But sometimes a body needs a second map, not to a door, he tapped the counter, but to a feeling. Matilda's brows lifted. What do you mean? Fagin gestured vaguely with one hand, as if drawing in the air. The chapel, he said. That little alcove. Cold stone. A man sits there and thinks he's doing the world a favour by not taking up space. But space is meant to be filled, my dear. That's what rooms are for. Samuel's cheeks coloured. I didn't mean... Fagin cut him off with a sniff. I know what you meant, he said, and I know what it felt like. So... He rummaged, producing a small candle, stubby, wrapped in paper. Take this. He held it out to Samuel. A candle? Samuel asked. A candle, Fagin confirmed. For the chapel gatehouse. Not to light yourself up like a show, but to leave behind. A little warmth where you were cold. A way of saying, he cleared his throat, irritated by his own tenderness. A way of saying, you've moved on. Samuel stared at the candle as if it were a strange gift indeed. Not for him, but for the place where he had been. Oliver's expression softened further, as though he understood at once. That's a good idea, Oliver said quietly. A gentle closing. Not forgetting, just... Shifting. Jack tilted his head, looking almost thoughtful. It's like leaving a coin on a windowsill, he said. Only warmer, and less likely to be stolen by a crow. Fagin shot him a look. Don't start on crows, he muttered, then turned back to Samuel. Well, will you do it? Samuel's fingers trembled slightly as he took the candle. His voice was low. Yes, he said. I will. Matilda watched him hold it, and she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not drama, only the soft sense that something had been restored. Then we shall go, Matilda said. It is not far, and the morning is still gentle. Fagin waved them toward the door as if shooing birds from a window ledge. Go on, he said, and come back later if you please. I'll put the kettle on. A proper kettle. Not that thin tea I sent last night. I've been ashamed of it ever since. Jack perked up. He admits shame, he cried. Mark the calendar. Oliver laughed softly, and even Fagin's eyes crinkled. They stepped back out into the fog-soft morning, Samuel carrying the candle and the notebook, Matilda walking at his side. Oliver calm and steady, Jack spinning occasional remarks like thread to keep the mood light. The chapel square was quieter than before, as if the night's hush had not entirely left. The stone walls held a faint dampness, and the air smelled of cold and old brick. The gatehouse alcove sat exactly as it had in the midnight hours, still a cupped hand of stone, still sheltering, still cold. Samuel stopped before it, looking at the recess as one might look at a place that had held them at their lowest. He did not speak for a moment. He simply breathed, and Matilda let him have the silence. Then Samuel stepped into the alcove and knelt. He placed the candle carefully on the stone ledge, its paper wrapper still around it. I don't have a match, he said, almost apologetically. Oliver reached into his coat pocket and produced a small box. I do, he said, and his tone made it clear that carrying matches was no great feat. Only preparedness. The way one carries kindness. He struck one. The tiny flame flared, bright against the grey morning, and he held it until the candle wick caught. A small, steady light appeared in the alcove, humble but real. Samuel stared at it. His throat worked. It's silly, he murmured, not looking away. Matilda shook her head gently. It's not, she said. It's a little warmth left behind, a sign to your own heart that you have moved from stone to hearth. Samuel's eyes were bright. He nodded once. Jack, for once, did not tease. He merely lifted his cap, a small gesture of respect, then murmured, "Well done, sir," as if Samuel had accomplished something quietly heroic. They stood for a moment longer, watching the candle's small flame steady itself against the chill air. The fog seemed to soften around it, as though even the mist approved. As they turned to go, a figure emerged from the chapel door, an older man in a dark coat, keys at his belt, his expression mildly suspicious in the way of a man responsible for holy things and therefore wary of nonsense. Mr. Brierly's message came to Matilda's mind at once. "Good morning," Matilda said politely. "Are you the verger?" "I am," the man replied, peering at them. Jack smiled innocently. "Morning," he said. "We're only being respectable." The verger looked as though he doubted the possibility. Matilda reached into her pocket and produced a small hymn book, thin, dark cover, the corners softened by use. She had taken it from Mr. Brierly before they left the shop, tucked it into her cloak like a small errand of courtesy. "Mr. Brierly asked me to return this," she said. "He said it was left in his shop again." The verger's face shifted into reluctant gratitude. "Ah," he said. "That book. Yes, I do misplace it." Jack leaned towards Samuel and whispered, "See? Even holy men lose things. That's proof the world's not run by perfection." The verger accepted the hymn book, clearing his throat. His gaze flicked to the candle in the alcove, then back to Samuel. "You left a light," he observed. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "For—" The verger's expression softened, just slightly. "That is no bad thing," he said. "It will burn a while. The stone can feel less cold with a little flame near it." Matilda smiled, warmed by the simple acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said. The verger nodded, then retreated back into the chapel, keys jingling softly like small bells. They walked back toward Ludgate Hill, the morning beginning to brighten in slow stages. The fog lifted a fraction, enough that the outlines of buildings sharpened. A baker's shop somewhere sent out a thread of warm bread scent, and the sound of a cart passing over cobbles came clearer now, less muffled by mist. Samuel touched his pocket again, candle gone. "Yes, but notebook present, map present, printer's card present. Each one a small anchor. I don't know why that helped," he said quietly, as they neared the boarding house. Leaving the candle, Matilda considered a moment. "Because you did something for the place that sheltered you," she said. "Instead of feeling ashamed of needing it, you honoured it. And by honouring it, you honoured yourself." Samuel's breath came slow. "My mother used to say," he murmured, "that if you wish to feel at home somewhere, you must leave a little kindness behind, like a crumb for your own heart to follow." Matilda's eyes warmed. "Your mother was wise," she said again. When they reached the boarding house, the lion-faced knocker glinted faintly in the clearing fog. Inside, the house felt alive with small morning sounds. A spoon stirring, a door opening, someone humming a tune under their breath. Samuel paused on the threshold, then looked at Matilda. His voice was soft, careful, as if asking permission for a new kind of habit. "Mrs. Crown," he said, "if you don't mind, I'd like to help, somehow. Not to pay you back," he hurried, catching himself, "not as a debt, only to be part of things." Matilda felt her chest fill with that quiet satisfaction again. "You may help by being here," she said, "by taking your tea, by resting. But if you wish to do something with your hands," she gestured toward the parlour, "there's always a kettle to fill and a fire to tend. Small things that make a house a house." Samuel nodded slowly, as if the simplicity was a gift. "Then I will," he said, and together they stepped into the warmth, leaving the fog behind the door, and letting the day steady, ordinary, quietly hopeful begin. The day did not hurry, and that suited the boarding house well. By late morning, the fog had thinned to a bright, milky veil, and the street outside had acquired that particular winter sound boots on damp stone, the soft clatter of a cart's harness, a vendor calling in a voice that was more suggestion than shout. Light came through the parlour curtains in a pale wash, turning the dust motes into slow floating pearls. The hearth still held a modest fire, not because the room could not do without it, but because London in January always felt improved by a little flame. Samuel kept his word about small helpfulness. Matilda found him, not long after breakfast, crouched by the grate with a coal scuttle at his knee, arranging the coals with careful hands as if he had been entrusted with something sacred. He did it quietly, without asking whether he was doing it correctly, and without apologizing for touching another household's routine. The very act had the air of a man trying a new posture in life, one where he belonged enough to contribute. "You've the knack," Matilda said, watching him for a moment. Samuel looked up, startled, then gave a faint smile. "My mother always said a fire is like a temper," he murmured. "If you feed it too fast, it roars. If you starve it, it sulks. But if you give it steady attention, it behaves." Matilda laughed softly. "Your mother had a way with comparisons." "She had a way with everything that mattered," Samuel replied. He placed one last coal with care, then sat back on his heels. The warmth rose to his hands, and he held them out as if to receive it properly. In the kitchen, Mrs. Pinner clattered about with the brisk confidence of a woman who believed that noise, when purposeful, was a form of reassurance. She sent Matilda off with laundry to fold, then called Samuel to help carry a pail, then decided she could manage the pail alone and sent him back again. It might have seemed like fussing, but Matilda knew better. Mrs. Pinner was weaving him into the fabric of the house one small errand at a time. By midday, the parlour had the pleasant look of a room that had been lived in gently. The kettle sat ready. The tea leaves Oliver had brought were portioned into a tin. The spare blanket remained on the chair, but now it looked less like an emergency measure and more like a kindness that had found its purpose. Samuel stood by the window once, lifting the curtain edge to peer out. He did not press his face to the glass like a child. He looked like a man reading the weather for meaning. "It's strange," he said quietly, "how London can look softer in daylight." "It's the fog," Matilda replied. "It forgives the sharp edges." Samuel nodded. "And yet it can also make you feel lost." "That's why we have lamps," Matilda said, "and doors, and people who know the way to a hearth." Samuel's hand went to his pocket again, touching the notebook Fagin had given him, as if the simple presence of paper could anchor him. "Mrs. Crown," he said after a moment, careful in his tone. Matilda turned from the sideboard where she had been straightening cups. "Yes? I want to go," he said. "I will go. But—" He hesitated, and Matilda could see the old habit trying to rise, the habit of doing everything alone to prove he deserved to exist. "I wondered if you might tell me what to expect, not because I cannot manage," he added quickly. "Only because I've been away from offices and counters for a time, and the thought of walking in and asking, it makes my stomach feel as if it has swallowed a stone." Matilda's expression softened. "Of course," she said, "and you needn't prove anything by suffering in silence. There is no prize for it." Samuel looked down, almost relieved to be told so plainly. Matilda took 2 cups from the shelf and set them on the table, then poured tea, not strong, not weak, the sort of tea that tastes like steady hands. They sat in the parlour with their cups between them, the clock ticking, the embers settling. "Fleet Street," Matilda said thoughtfully. "It is busy, yes, and full of ink and paper and opinions. But Hawthorne and Wick, if Mr. Brierly trusts them, will not be unkind. You go in clean, you speak calmly, and you remember that asking for work is not begging, it is offering your time and skill." Samuel's mouth tightened, as if holding back a protest. Matilda went on gently. "You may feel your voice tremble. Let it. Speak anyway. And if you need something to hold," she nodded to his pocket, "you can hold the notebook, or the map, or the card. London respects paper more than it ought, and sometimes it helps to have a bit of it with you." Samuel let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That sounds like London," he murmured. "It is," Matilda said. Then, after a pause, she added, "If you like, I will walk with you as far as the corner. Not inside unless you ask, but as far as the street where the door is. Sometimes it helps to know you've already succeeded in one part of it, the walking." Samuel's eyes warmed. "I would like that." he admitted. Matilda nodded. Then that is settled. It was then that the bell at the front door chimed, and in came Oliver, cheeks pink from the cold, scarf snug at his throat. Behind him, like a gust of laughter attempting respectability, came Jack Dawkins. "Afternoon," Jack announced, stamping his boots with just enough force to suggest he had been outdoors in a heroic manner. Mrs. Pinner appeared in the doorway at once, hands on hips. Jack's grin widened. "Madam, I would never offend a mat," he declared, wiping his boots with exaggerated care. Oliver nodded politely to Samuel. "How are you feeling today?" he asked. Samuel rose from his chair, a little awkward, then remembered himself and offered his hand. "Better," he said quietly. "Truly. Thank you." Oliver's handshake was gentle, not firm to prove anything, just present. "I'm glad," he said. His gaze flicked to Matilda, and there was quiet pride in it, as if he thought, "Yes, this is how the world ought to work." Jack wandered toward the hearth, hands outstretched. "Any news from the city?" he asked, as though the fire were a gossip. Matilda poured tea for both boys, and Jack accepted his cup like a man accepting a trophy. "We've been to see Mr. Fagin," Oliver said, settling into a chair. "He asked after Mr. Harker twice, and then pretended he hadn't asked at all." Jack snorted. "He's a fountain of concern, that one," he said, spouting kindness all over the place, and then complaining the floor's wet. Matilda smiled. "Did he send anything?" she asked, though she felt something in her chest tighten with a small expectation. Fagin had said, after all, that he'd been thinking. Oliver reached into his coat pocket and drew out a wrapped parcel, tied with string and sealed with a dab of wax. "He asked me to give this to you," he said, placing it carefully on the table. He said it was time. Matilda stared at the parcel. The paper looked old, not used, but chosen. The string was tied neatly, as if by someone who took pride in making things secure. "What is it?" she asked softly. Jack sipped his tea. "If it's a live creature, I'm leaving," he warned. Oliver's lips twitched. "It's not," he said. "At least, I don't think so." Matilda untied the string with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. The paper loosened, revealing a flat object inside, wrapped in cloth. When she drew the cloth away, she saw a small wooden plaque, rectangular, painted on one side. Her breath caught. It was the old sign from her tea shop. The paint had faded, yes, and there was a small chip on one corner, but the lettering was unmistakable, written in her husband's careful hand. "Crown's Tea Room Warm Cups. Quiet company." For a moment, the parlour around her went softly out of focus, as if the past had leaned in close. She saw again the bell above her shop door, the polished counter, the way the window steamed on winter days. She remembered her husband's fingers stained faintly with paint, his tongue poking out in concentration as he wrote the words. She remembered standing beside him, laughing, saying the last line was too sentimental, and him answering that tea was sentimental by nature. Matilda's eyes stung. She blinked slowly, not wanting tears to fall onto the sign. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Mr. Fagin." Oliver watched her with gentle understanding. "He said he bought it at a sale some years ago," Oliver murmured. "He said it looked lonely among stranger things, and he kept it because it felt like warmth that had lost its door." Jack leaned in, squinting at the lettering. "Crown's Tea Room," he read, then looked up at Matilda. His voice for once had no theatre in it. "That was yours." Matilda nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Samuel, who had been silent, looked from the sign to Matilda's face with sudden comprehension. "You had a tea shop," he said quietly. "I did," Matilda managed. Her voice was steady, but thin. "A small one." Oliver's tone softened. "Mr. Fagin said he didn't know how to return it before," he said. "He said he's not good at giving back things that belong to someone's heart. He's better at giving directions." Jack sniffed. "He's better at pretending he's not tender," he corrected. Matilda ran her fingers lightly over the chipped corner. The wood felt familiar, as if it remembered her hands. "Why now?" she asked, more to herself than anyone else. Samuel spoke, softly, as though stepping into a room on tiptoe. "Because you opened your hearth to someone who needed it," he said. "And perhaps the sign has found its door again." Matilda turned to him. The firelight warmed his face, and his expression was sincere, not flattering, not overly grateful, simply true. Matilda felt something in her chest loosen. the way a ribbon loosens when you untie it rather than snapping it apart. Yes, she whispered. Yes, perhaps it has. Oliver cleared his throat gently, as if offering her a path out of emotion without embarrassment. Mr. Fagin asked me to tell you, he said, that if you hang it in the parlour, it might make the room feel like your shop again. Only quieter. Jack perked up immediately, relieved to have a practical solution. Hang it, he cried. Yes, that's the thing. And I will hang it if you like. I'm excellent with height. You're excellent with falling, Oliver murmured. Jack ignored him. I've hung many things, he declared. Coats. Hats. My dignity. Mrs. Pinner appeared in the doorway again, having heard enough to be curious despite herself. She stared at the sign, her expression shifting into something almost tender before she caught it. Well, she said briskly, if we're going to be sentimental, we might as well do it properly. That sign shouldn't be sitting on a table like a biscuit. Put it up. Matilda laughed, a small, broken laugh that felt like relief. Jack sprang into action at once, as if the room had become a stage for his greatest triumph. He fetched a hammer from somewhere Mrs. Pinner kept it, found a nail, and held the sign up to various places while making pronouncements. Here, above the mantel, he said. No too grand. Here, by the doorway, so it greets you. No, wait here, where the firelight touches it in the evening. That's the spot. Look how it glows. Samuel rose quietly and took the hammer from Jack with a gentle firmness. May I? He asked Matilda. Matilda met his gaze. She saw in him the desire to be part of things again, to have his hands involved in making a home, not just receiving it. Yes, she said softly. Please. Samuel measured carefully, as if he feared doing harm to something precious. He placed the nail, tapped it in with steady strikes, not loud, not harsh, just firm enough. Then he lifted the sign and settled it onto the nail. Crown's Tea Room Warm Cups. Quiet company. It hung near the hearth, where the firelight could reach it, and where anyone entering the parlour would see it without having to look up. The room seemed to sigh in satisfaction, as if some missing piece had been returned. Matilda stared at it, her hands clasped lightly at her waist. For a moment she could not speak. Oliver spoke quietly, as if narrating a gentle truth. You make warmth wherever you are, he said. A shop was only one way of doing it. Jack nodded vigorously. Exactly, he agreed. A shop is bricks and a bell. You're the tea. Matilda smiled through the sting in her eyes. Thank you, she said, voice soft. All of you. Mrs. Pinner sniffed. If that sign means we're serving tea more often, then I approve, she announced, pretending that was the only reason her voice sounded a little thicker. And if it means lodgers feel more at ease, then well, that's good business. Jack beamed. Hear that? We've become an institution. Samuel looked at the sign again, then at Matilda. When I sat in that stone alcove last night, he said quietly, I thought warmth was something other people owned, something you had to earn the right to touch. But this, he gestured gently to the room, this feels like warmth that wants to be shared. Matilda's chest filled, not with sadness now, but with a calm, steady gratitude. It does, she said, and perhaps it always has. Outside, the afternoon light was fading already, as winter light does, slipping away without fuss. The fog began to thicken again, at the edges of the street, and somewhere a lamplighter's pole tapped gently as he made his rounds. Inside, the parlour felt newly claimed not as a grand transformation, but as a return, a sign reclaimed. A corner of London made welcoming again, and in the soft glow of the hearth, with teacups warm between hands, Matilda felt her own homecoming begin not to a shop on a street, but to the simple, enduring truth that her kindness had always been a door, and people tired, hopeful people had only ever needed a gentle knock. As afternoon slid toward evening, the boarding house grew cozier rather than darker. The fog thickened again outside, returning with that familiar London patience, and the gas lamps along the street blinked into life one by one, each flame blooming a small halo in the mist. In the parlour, the new old sign caught the firelight and held it Crown's Tea Room Warm Cups, quiet company, until the words seemed less like paint and more like a promise. Matilda found herself glancing at it when she thought no one was watching. Not with grief, exactly, more with a quiet astonishment, as if the city had gently handed back something she assumed was gone for good. She had not asked for it, had not gone seeking it, It had simply returned on the heels of a night's small errand, on the strength of a hand-drawn map, on the simple act of making room. Samuel noticed her looking. He said nothing at first. He only rose, fetched a cloth from the sideboard, and dusted the mantel with careful attention, moving objects not at all, merely tidying the edges of the day. It was a small thing, and yet Matilda recognized it for what it was, a way of saying, without burdening her with words, that he understood she had been handed a tender memory, and that he would treat it gently. When the tea was brewed again, this time with Oliver's fragrant leaves, Mrs. Pinner herself carried a plate of bread and cheese into the parlour, pretending it was purely practical. "Winter eats through a person," she declared. "Better to fill up now than complain later." Jack Dawkins arrived soon after, as if the smell of food had called him. He wore an air of importance, and he had a scarf wound around his neck in a way that suggested he'd tied it while running. "I've news," he announced, before he'd even fully shut the door behind him. Oliver followed more quietly, bringing a small bundle, something wrapped in brown paper, likely another stray object that had found its way into his care. He nodded to Matilda, his eyes lingering on the sign with a pleased softness. Fagin came last, as if making an entrance was part of his constitution. He was bundled in a coat that had seen better years but still held warmth, and his spectacles fogged slightly when he stepped inside. He peered about the parlour with quick, bright eyes. "Well," he said, as if evaluating a fine shop window. "Would you look at that?" Matilda's throat tightened again, though this time it was accompanied by a smile. "Mr. Fagin," she said softly. "You shouldn't have." Fagin waved his hand as if batting away a fly. Shouldn't have, he muttered. "If I listened to what I shouldn't have done, I'd never have done a thing in my life. Besides," he nodded towards Samuel, "you've gone and made me sentimental. It's catchin'," Jack crowed. "He admits it again." Oliver moved to greet Fagin, helping him with his coat as naturally as if they were family. Samuel stood near the hearth, unsure whether he ought to make space, yet not wanting to retreat. When Fagin noticed him, he pointed a finger like a conductor, calling a musician to readiness. "You," Fagin said. "How's the room?" Samuel blinked. "Warm," he said simply. Then, after a moment, "Safe." Fagin's face softened for an instant, and then he covered it with briskness. "Good," he said. "That's what rooms are for." Mrs. Pinner sniffed. "Rooms are for paying," she added. Fagin gave her a look of outrage. "Madam," he said, "must you ruin every tender moment?" "Yes," Mrs. Pinner replied, untroubled. "It keeps things balanced." The parlour filled with the comfortable sounds of people sharing warmth, the scrape of a chair, the soft clink of cups, the kettle's gentle sigh. Outside, fog pressed to the window as if curious, but inside, the hearth held steady. Jack's news, it turned out, was not dramatic. Jack rarely dealt in drama that didn't benefit him, but it was useful. "I went past Fleet Street," he said, leaning forward as though confiding state secrets. "Past Hawthorne and Wick, I had a look through the window. There's 2 men in there, one with ink all over his hands, and one with a moustache like a broom. They look like they've been complaining since birth, but the place smells of paper and decent wages." Samuel's fingers tightened around his cup. You scouted it?" Jack shrugged grandly. "Of course I did. I'm a guide, ain't I? Besides, I wanted to see if the door was the sort that bites." Oliver's tone was mild, amused. "And does it?" Jack considered. "It creaks," he pronounced, "but that's just old wood speaking its mind." Matilda watched Samuel's face. The apprehension was there, yes, but there was something else as well now, an emerging steadiness, as if the fear no longer took up the whole room inside him. Samuel drew out the card Mr. Brierly had given him and set it on the table like a sacred thing. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, as much to himself as to them. "I'll go tomorrow." Fagin nodded briskly. "Good," he said again. "And mind you don't apologize your way right back out the door." Samuel managed a faint smile. "I'm trying." Oliver's voice was gentle. "You don't have to try alone," he said. Jack lifted his cup. "A toast," he declared, "to doors that don't bite and chairs that do." Mrs. Pinner looked appalled. "Chairs don't bite," Jack winked. "Not in your house, madam. You run a disciplined establishment." Laughter quiet. Warm laughter moved through the room, soft as the crackle of coals. Matilda felt for a brief moment as if her old tea shop had returned not in brick and bell, but in the truer form, people at ease. Later, when Fagin and the boys had gone, Fagin pretending he had errands, though his eyes kept flicking towards Samuel, as if to check he remained real, Matilda tidied the cups and banked the fire. Samuel lingered near the sign, looking at it as though reading a line in a favourite book. "It's strange," he murmured. "What is?" Matilda asked, gathering the cloths. "That a sign can make a room feel different," Samuel said. "As if it declares something." Matilda nodded, understanding. "It does," she said. "It tells you what kind of warmth to expect." Samuel's fingers drifted to the notebook in his pocket. "Mr. Fagin gave me this," he said, pulling it out and holding it with care. "He said pages are patient." "They are," Matilda agreed. Samuel hesitated, then sat at the small table near the hearth and opened the notebook. The first page was blank and pale, waiting without judgment. "I'd like to write something," he said quietly. "Not much, just something to begin." Matilda did not hover. She moved to the sideboard, giving him space while remaining near enough to be present, like a lamp in the corner. Samuel took the pencil. Matilda offered an ordinary pencil, its end worn blunt, and held it over the page. He stared for a long moment, as if facing the same old difficulty, accepting that his thoughts deserved a place. Then he began to write, slowly, in careful script. Matilda could not see the words clearly from where she stood, and she did not try. She only watched his shoulders settle, watched his breathing slow. A man writing by a hearth was, in itself, a kind of homecoming. When he finished, Samuel closed the notebook as gently as one might close a door quietly so as not to wake someone sleeping. He looked up at Matilda, his eyes clearer than they had been the night before. "It helps," he said simply. Matilda smiled. "Then keep doing it," she replied. That night, sleep came more easily to the boarding house. The wind outside sighed, the fog held the street in its soft palm, and the gas lamps burned with their steady halos. The clock ticked, untroubled, the fire dimmed to a glow, and upstairs, in his small room with a view of chimneys, Samuel Harker slept longer, his hands no longer clenched even in dreams. Morning arrived again in quiet stages. Matilda rose early, as she always did, and brewed tea before the house properly woke. She laid out Samuel's coat near the kitchen range, so it could take a little warmth into its fibres. "Missus." Pinner grumbled about the cold and then softened as soon as she tasted the first cup. Samuel came down with his collar straight and his hair combed, his boots cleaned as best as could be managed. There was a dignity in his effort that made Matilda's heart lift, not because cleanliness solved anything, but because it showed he believed he had somewhere worth walking into. Oliver arrived just after breakfast, as if drawn by the day's importance. He carried himself quietly, but his eyes were bright. "I'll walk with you," Oliver said to Samuel gently. "If you like, not all the way in unless you want it, but as far as the street." Samuel glanced at Matilda, then nodded. "I would like that," he admitted. Jack appeared a moment later, breathless and gleeful, as though he had been waiting outside just to be part of the procession. "I'm coming too," he declared. "I'm excellent at standing about looking supportive." Mrs. Pinner gave him a look. "You're excellent at standing about," she agreed. Fagin, of all surprises, arrived last coat buttoned, scarf snug, his face arranged into an expression that said he was only there for practical reasons and not because he cared. "I was passin'," he insisted, when Matilda raised her brows. "Passin' what?" Jack asked. "Your own shop?" Fagin glared at him. "Passin' my own impatience," he snapped. "Now, let's get on with it. If we're going to make a respectable man out of this one, we'd best begin before the city changes its mind." Samuel looked overwhelmed by the escort 4 people and a whole boarding house's worth of warmth behind him. His instinct, Matilda saw, was to protest, to shrink away from being fussed over. Matilda touched his arm lightly. "You needn't carry this alone," she said, voice soft. "Let us walk with you. You don't owe us anything for it." Samuel swallowed. "Thank you," he whispered, and then, a little more firmly, "All right." They stepped out into the morning fog, which was thinner now and streaked with pale light. The gas lamps were being extinguished again, their halos fading. London's daybreath began. Carts, footsteps, distant bells. As they walked, Fagin kept up a muttering commentary, as if talking prevented him from feeling too much. "Don't fidget," he told Samuel. "Stand straight, but not like a broom handle. And speak clear, not loud, clear. People mistake quiet for weakness, but quiet's often the strongest thing in the room. Jack nodded as if this were wisdom he'd invented. Clear, he echoed. Like a bell. A polite bell. Oliver said little, but his presence was steady. He walked beside Samuel like a calm line in a map, something reliable to follow when the mind began to swirl. Matilda stayed a half step behind, watching Samuel's shoulders, his hands, the little signs of tension. She saw him breathe in, slow. She saw him breathe out, slower. She saw him pass the narrow bookshop doorway beneath the hissing gas lamp, and she remembered the map's little drawing how ink had turned into street. At the corner, Mr. Brierly was opening his shop, turning the sign and adjusting a stack of books in the window. He looked up and saw them a small procession, and his brows lifted. Well, he said, mild amusement in his voice. If this isn't a committee, Jack bowed. We're escorting a gentleman to his future, he declared. Mr. Brierly's gaze softened at Samuel. Good, he said simply. Go on then. And remember, ask for Mr. Wick. Samuel nodded, clutching the card in his pocket as if it were a compass. They continued toward Fleet Street. The street itself had a different energy, more movement, more voices, more wheels and paper and ink. It was not loud in a violent way, only busy, like a room full of people talking at once. Hawthorne and Wick sat among other shops, its window filled with stationery, stacks of paper, jars of pens, bundles of twine, a display of sealing wax in deep reds and blacks. Inside, the smell of ink was stronger, and the light from the front window fell across a counter worn smooth by years of transactions. Samuel stopped before the door, his breath hitched. Matilda leaned in slightly, her voice for him alone. One step, she said. Only one. The rest will follow. Samuel nodded, then reached for the handle. The door creaked just as Jack had foretold, and opened. Warmth and ink scent met them, less cosy than hearth warmth, but still human. Two men looked up from behind the counter, one with ink-stained fingers and a sharp, intelligent face, the other with a moustache indeed like a broom, his expression already halfway to a complaint. Samuel stepped inside. Oliver remained just outside the threshold, giving him room. Matilda did the same. Jack leaned against the shop front with exaggerated casualness. Fagin stood a little apart, watching as if he were about to pretend he wasn't watching. Through the window, Matilda could see Samuel speak, his mouth forming careful words. She saw the moustached man frown, then the ink-handed man tilt his head, listening. Samuel handed over Mr. Brierly's card. The ink-handed man's expression shifted recognition, perhaps, or respect for the bookseller's name. Time moved strangely in such moments. A few minutes feeling like a long walk through fog. At last, the door opened again, and Samuel stepped back out. His face was pale with adrenaline, but there was a light in his eyes. Matilda's heart lifted before he even spoke. He took one breath, then another, and looked at them, at Oliver, at Jack, at Fagin, at Matilda. They asked me to return this afternoon, he said quietly, as if afraid the words might break if spoken too boldly. To copy some figures, to show I can do the ledger work. Jack whooped, then clapped a hand over his mouth. I mean excellent, he corrected, in a strained whisper. Oliver's smile was gentle and bright all at once. That's good, he said. Fagin sniffed as if unimpressed, though his eyes shone. Of course they did, he muttered. Any fool can see you've got steady hands. Samuel's shoulders dropped, as if something heavy had slid off them. Mr. Wick, he added, voice steadier now, said, if it goes well, there may be a place. Matilda's throat tightened with relief. It will go well, she said softly. You've already done the hardest part. Samuel glanced back at the shop door, then at the street, then at the small group gathered around him like a living map. I didn't know, he whispered, that London could feel like this. Jack nudged him lightly with an elbow. Like what? Samuel searched for the word, then found it. Possible, he said. The fog drifted past, the gas lamp halos in the distance fading as day strengthened, and Matilda felt that deep, quiet satisfaction again, not triumph, not spectacle, only the sense of a weary newcomer being gently guided toward a hearth-warm room inside the vastness of the city. They began to walk back toward Ludgate Hill, unhurried, letting the morning carry them, and letting hope, quiet, steady hope, walk beside them as naturally as any friend. They walked back from Fleet Street at a pace that did not tempt the heart into racing again. London moved around them in its morning manner, busy, yes, but not unkind. The carts rolled, the shop doors opened, the smells of ink and bread and damp wool threaded the air. The fog had retreated to the higher corners of the street and the deep alleys, leaving the main thoroughfares clearer, though every so often it drifted across like a shy curtain, softening a sharp roofline or turning a distant lamp into a pale coin of light. Samuel kept touching the inside pocket of his coat, where Mr. Brierly's card lay, as if it might escape without warning. Yet the touch was not frantic now. It was almost grateful, like patting a book to make sure it was real. Jack Dawkins, emboldened by success and incapable of leaving silence alone for long, decided to conduct the return journey as though it were a victory parade. "Don't look so surprised," he told Samuel, strolling with his hands behind his back like a gentleman of leisure. "You walked in, you spoke, you survived. That's half of London conquered already." "I don't feel like I conquered anything," Samuel admitted, though his voice held a new steadiness. Jack scoffed. "Conquering is overrated," he said. "Belonging is the true trick, and you're learning it." Oliver walked beside Samuel, quiet as ever, offering his presence like a steady rail on a staircase. Fagin had taken to lagging slightly behind, pretending he had become fascinated by a shop window, then by a crack in the pavement, then by the shape of a chimney. Anything, really, except the obvious truth that he did not want to appear overly invested. Matilda, watching him out of the corner of her eye, felt a soft fondness. Fagin's feelings tended to wear disguises. As they passed the narrow bookshop doorway beneath the hissing gas lamp, the lamp still sang its faint, steady hiss, though daylight had strengthened. Mr. Brierly was inside now, arranging books with the reverence of a man laying out chapel hymnals. He glanced up as they passed, and gave a small, approving nod. No fuss, no fanfare, only a quiet acknowledgement that Samuel had done the brave thing. Samuel's gaze lingered on the shop window, then on the familiar corner where the fog had seemed so thick on the first night. He looked, for a moment, like a man watching his own life from a distance, astonished at how quickly a place could change in meaning. Matilda did not hurry him. She knew such moments mattered, not because they were dramatic, but because they were the small turning points a heart used to measure itself. When they reached Ludgate Hill again, the slope felt gentler than it had the night before. At the front door, Fagin paused, cleared his throat, and made a show of checking his pocket, as if he might have forgotten something essential. "Well," he said brusquely, "I've got things to do. Shops don't run themselves, you know. Kettles don't boil without encouragement." Jack grinned. "You'll come back later," he said, too cheerfully. Fagin glared at him. "I might," he said, offended. "If I feel like it." Oliver's eyes warmed. "We'll see you later," he said gently, as if accepting Fagin's bluster as a familiar coat. Fagin harumphed, then looked at Samuel with a sharpness that was mostly protective. "And you," he said, "don't you go thinking this afternoon's test is some sort of judgment on your worth. It's only figures. Figures are dull. You're more interesting than that." Samuel blinked, surprised by the direct kindness. "Thank you," he said softly. Fagin waved the thanks away as if it were smoke, then turned and disappeared back into the fog, shoulders hunched, muttering to himself like a man arguing with his own tenderness. Jack watched him go, then sighed dramatically. "He's a deep well," he declared. Oliver murmured. "He is." Inside the boarding house, warmth met them again, coal heat, kettle steam, the faint, lingering perfume of tea. The parlour sign caught Matilda's eye at once, as if greeting her, warm cups, quiet company. The words seemed to glow in the day's pale light, as though pleased to be used. Mrs. Pinner appeared in the hall like a sentry. "Well?" she demanded. "Did you get eaten?" Jack made a face. "Not even a nibble," he said. "Disappointing, really." Samuel hesitated, then spoke before the old shame could take him. "They asked me to return this afternoon," he said. "To copy figures. If it goes well, there may be a place." Mrs. Pinner studied him, then nodded briskly. "Good," she said. "Then you'll eat properly at noon, so your brain doesn't fall out halfway through a ledger, and you'll wash your hands before you go back, because ink smells like trouble." Samuel's mouth twitched. "Yes, ma'am." Matilda felt something in her chest settle gratitude for Mrs. Pinner's blunt care, which was its own kind of blanket. The hours between morning and afternoon unfurled gently. Matilda kept the household moving with small tasks folding, mending, laying out cups, while Samuel did what he could to occupy his mind without tiring it. He sat at the parlour table with Fagin's notebook open, writing a few careful lines now and then closing it as though he were tucking in a thought. At one point, Oliver brought a small bundle of papers he'd found among the odds and ends. In Fagin's shop, discarded sheets with old sums, half-finished ledgers, the sorts of things that would have been thrown away if Fagin weren't inclined to rescue paper the way some people rescued cats. "I thought these might help," Oliver said quietly, laying them on the table. "To practice, if you like." Samuel's eyes widened. "You brought these for me?" Oliver nodded. "It's only paper," he said, as though paper were nothing. But Matilda saw the kindness in it, a way of making the afternoon's test feel less like a cliff and more like a step. Samuel picked up one sheet and studied the columns, the neat lines of numbers. His finger traced them lightly, not with panic, but with the focused calm of someone returning to a skill he'd once relied upon. "I haven't done this in months," he admitted. "You have done it before," Matilda replied, setting a cup of tea beside him. "Your hands remember what your worries try to forget." Samuel looked up at her, and the gratitude in his face was quiet but deep. "Thank you," he said. Matilda only nodded, letting the thanks land without turning it into a burden. Jack Dawkins, for his part, could not bear such earnestness without attempting to put a ribbon on it. He stationed himself by the window, peering out and making pronouncements about the street as if he were a general surveying a battlefield. "Fog's liftin'," he reported, "which means the city's feelin' bold." "That's always suspicious." Oliver smiled faintly. "The city isn't a person, Jack." Jack looked scandalized. "Isn't it?" he demanded. "Then what's been glaring at me all these years?" Samuel, to Matilda's quiet delight, let out a small laugh. It was the kind of laugh that loosened the chest rather than tightening it. When midday came, Mrs. Pinner insisted on a proper meal stew warmed on the range, bread, a modest slice of cheese. Samuel ate without apologizing, though his appetite wavered with nerves. Matilda watched him drink water and breathe slowly, as she had encouraged the night before, and she saw him practicing a new habit, allowing his body to be cared for even when his mind was anxious. After lunch, Oliver rose. "I'll go with you," he said to Samuel gently, "as far as the street, if you'd like." Samuel swallowed, then nodded. "I would," he said. Jack sprang up as well. "And I will stand outside looking like a bodyguard," he announced. "People respect a bodyguard. They don't know I'm mostly theatre." Mrs. Pinner sniffed. "Theatre doesn't pay rent," she called after them. "It pays in spirit," Jack protested, already halfway down the hall. Matilda walked with them to the door, pulling her shawl about her shoulders even though she would not go far. The fog had thickened again, returning with afternoon chill. The gas lamps had begun to glow earlier than they ought, their halos growing in the mist like little moons. At the threshold, Samuel paused. He looked at Matilda, and she saw the old reflex rising, the instinct to say sorry for taking up space, sorry for needing company, sorry for being human. Matilda spoke before the apology could form. "You don't need to be brave in a loud way," she said softly. "Just take your step." Samuel drew a slow breath. "All right," he whispered. Oliver touched his shoulder lightly, no pressure, only presence. Jack tipped his cap like a man sending someone off to sea. Samuel stepped into the fog and began to walk. Matilda watched them go until the mist took them. Then she closed the door softly, keeping the warmth inside like a held breath. The afternoon stretched. Matilda busied herself with small, gentle tasks that soothed her as much as they served the house. She polished the teapot, straightened the chairs, adjusted the sign so it sat perfectly level. She sat for a time by the hearth, hands folded, listening to the clock and the faint sounds of London beyond the curtain's wheels, distant voices, the soft hiss of gaslight outside. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to her old tea shop. Yet now, with the sign above the hearth, the memory no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like a room connected to this one, as if time had quietly drawn a corridor between them. She remembered her husband's voice, the way he'd teased her for being too quiet when customers came in. "Matty," he'd said once, laughing, "you don't sell tea with silence alone." And she had replied, "Some folk come in for the silence, not the tea," he'd grinned. "Then sell both. Warm cups, quiet company." Yes, that had always been the true offering. The bell at the front door chimed late in the afternoon, and Matilda's heart lifted before she knew who it was. She rose, smoothing her apron, listening. Footsteps in the hall, 2 sets. Then a third, with an extra bounce. Jack's voice arrived first. "We return," he announced, as though announcing a royal procession. Oliver's voice followed, calm and pleased. "Mrs. Crown," and then Samuel appeared in the parlour doorway. For a moment he simply stood there, fog clinging faintly to his coat, cheeks flushed from cold and from the effort of being judged by strangers. His eyes were bright, not with panic, but with something newly alive. Matilda went still. Samuel swallowed. His hand went, as if without thinking, to the pocket where Fagin's notebook rested. Then he let his shoulders drop. "I did it," he said quietly. Jack clapped, then remembered himself and clapped softly. "Of course you did," he said. "You've got ledger hands." Oliver smiled, the kind of smile that warmed without dazzling. "How did it go?" he asked gently. Samuel exhaled slowly, as if releasing the afternoon from his lungs. "Mr. Wick watched me," he said. He didn't speak much. He frowned. "I thought I'd done something wrong. My ink blotched once, and my hand shook at the beginning." Matilda's fingers tightened around her own hands. Samuel continued, voice steadier as he spoke. "But then when I finished, he checked the sums twice. And he looked at me, and he said—" Samuel paused, as though the words were precious enough to handle carefully. He said, "You're slow at first, but you're accurate. Accuracy is what we pay for." Jack leaned toward Matilda and whispered loudly, "That's practically poetry." Samuel's mouth twitched. "Then he told me," he went on, "to come in tomorrow morning. Not for a trial, for work." Matilda felt her chest fill in a way that almost hurt relief, blooming warm and sudden, like the first good swallow of tea after a long cold walk. "Oh, Mr. Harker," she whispered. Samuel's eyes shone, and he blinked as if surprised by his own emotion. He began, then stopped, then tried again. I didn't know what to do when he said it. I only nodded. I said thank you. I didn't apologize," he added quickly, almost proud. "I didn't. I wanted to, but I didn't." Oliver's voice was soft with approval. "That's very good," he said. Jack threw his arms wide. "We must celebrate," he declared. "A biscuit at least. Perhaps 2. Mrs. Pinner appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the word celebrate. She took one look at Samuel's face and understood at once, though she pretended she didn't. "So," she said briskly, "you're employed." Samuel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Pinner sniffed, then turned away as if the matter were small. "Good," she said. "Then you'll pay rent like a respectable creature, and I won't have to listen to my own worry at night. Tea's on. Sit down before you topple." Jack beamed. "She loves you," he whispered to Samuel. "She does not," Mrs. Pinner called without turning. "And if you say so again, I'll have you out shoveling snow that hasn't fallen." Matilda laughed softly, unable to help it, and the sound felt like something unclenching. They sat in the parlour as evening gathered. The fog outside thickened into a velvety curtain, and the gas lamps glowed with their amber halos. Inside, the hearth fire warmed the room with steady patience. The sign above the mantel seemed to glow more deeply now, as if pleased by the company beneath it. Matilda poured tea more cups than usual, the kind of abundance that was not extravagant but heartfelt. Oliver accepted his cup with both hands, quiet gratitude in his eyes. Jack accepted his with dramatic reverence, as if tea were a rare spirit. Samuel held his cup as though it were proof of the day's reality. Fagin did not come that evening, at least not into the parlour. But later, when the street outside was fully fog-wrapped and the lamps burned like floating stars, Matilda heard the faintest tap at the front door. Twice, then once. She opened it to find a small parcel on the step and no one in sight. Only the fog and a faint echo of hurried footsteps retreating down the street. Matilda brought the parcel inside, smiling to herself, and unfolded the paper by the hearth. Inside was a tin of biscuits better than ordinary, the kind with a little sugar sparkle and a note in Fagin's slanting hand. For the new clerk, to keep his head sweet when the figures go sour. And for Mrs. Crown, in case she forgets she's still the best tea seller in London. Don't tell Jack I wrote that. Matilda's eyes warmed. She set the tin on the table and let the note rest beneath the firelight like a secret kept kindly. Samuel read it, and for the first time since Matilda had met him, he laughed openly, softly, but without restraint. The sound filled the parlour, and seemed to settle into the walls like warmth. Outside, London continued its winter-breathing fog, gaslight, the distant roll of wheels. Inside, the boarding house held its quiet company, and the day's small victory turned slowly into evening calm. And as the hour grew later, and the fire sank to a deeper glow, Matilda watched Samuel's shoulders loosen in his chair, watched Oliver's eyelids grow heavy in the warmth, watched Jack's chatter soften into murmurs. She felt, in the simplest way, that the map had done what it was meant to do, not only guiding feet through fog, but guiding a weary heart into belonging. The evening after the biscuit tin arrived did not turn into anything grand, and that was precisely why it felt so good. It became instead an evening of small, contented sounds. The soft scrape of a chair as someone shifted nearer the hearth, the whisper of cloth as Matilda folded napkins, the gentle clink of teacups set down without haste. Outside, the fog thickened into a deep, velvet hush, and the gas lamps shone like patient stars. Every so often a carriage passed, its wheels sounding as though they rolled through wool. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed the hour, softened by mist. Samuel sat with a notebook open on his knee, not writing much, only turning the pencil between his fingers as if thinking of what ought to be said to a page that waited so kindly. Oliver dozed in a chair near the fire, his head tipped slightly, breath slow and even. Jack tried, for perhaps 3 full minutes, to be quiet out of respect for Oliver's sleep, then began whispering dramatic commentary to Matilda about the proper way to celebrate a clerk's employment. Somebody should throw a hat, he whispered. A respectable hat, or perhaps a stack of paper. Paper's festive, very Fleet Street. Matilda shook her head, smiling. We will celebrate by letting the fire burn steady and the tea stay warm, she whispered back. Jack pressed a hand to his chest as if wounded. You're a woman of restraint, he murmured. It's a rare form of bravery. Mrs. Pinner, passing through with a folded cloth, gave Jack a look that could have curdled milk. If you throw paper in my parlour, you'll spend the week sweeping it up, she said. Jack bowed. Then I shall keep my festivities internal, he declared. Eventually, even Jack's energy softened. The hour grew late. Oliver stirred, blinked as if waking from a pleasant shore, and rose with quiet politeness. I should go, he said softly. Mr. Fagin will worry if I'm late, even if he pretends he doesn't. Jack took this as his cue to stretch and yawn theatrically. And I, he announced, must go attend to my many responsibilities. Mrs. Pinner snorted. Your responsibilities are imaginary. Jack smiled serenely. All the best ones are. They gathered their coats, and Matilda walked them to the door. On the threshold, Oliver paused and glanced back at the parlour sign glowing in the firelight. It looks right there, he said quietly. Matilda's fingers brushed the edge of her shawl. It does, she murmured. Oliver's eyes warmed. Good night, Mrs. Crown, he said. Good night, Oliver. Jack tipped his cap at Samuel. Sleep like a gentleman, he advised. Tomorrow you'll be a man of ink. Samuel's mouth twitched. Good night, Jack. Jack leaned in and added, in a conspiratorial whisper, if the figures misbehave, glare at them. They respect confidence. Then they were gone, 2 shapes swallowed gently by fog and gaslight, their footsteps fading into the city's winter hush. Matilda closed the door and turned back toward the parlour. The room seemed to hold its warmth a little closer now, as though pleased with itself. Samuel rose slowly from his chair, notebook tucked under his arm. I should go up, he said, voice quiet. Tomorrow comes early. It does, Matilda agreed. She hesitated, then added, if you wake in the night again, the fire will still be here, and the kettle can always be boiled. Samuel's eyes shone with gratitude. Thank you, he said. Then, with an effort that made his voice firmer, I'll try to sleep without worrying the clock. Matilda smiled. Let the clock do its job, she said. You do yours in the morning. Samuel nodded and went upstairs. His footsteps were careful, but they did not carry the same fearful hesitation as the first night. When his door closed, it sounded like a settling, not a retreat. Matilda returned to the parlour, banked the fire, and looked once more at the sign. Warm cups, quiet company. It felt less like a memory now, and more like an instruction the world had always meant her to follow. She went to bed with that thought, and slept with a steadiness she had not realised she'd been missing. Morning arrived in pale greys and softened edges. The fog still lingered, but it was a gentler fog, more a shawl than a wall. The gas lamps burned faintly and would soon be snuffed, their halos dissolving as daylight strengthened. The boarding house smelled of tea and coal and clean linen, the scent of ordinary life beginning again. Samuel came down early, already dressed. His coat was brushed, his collar straight. His boots shone with the careful effort of someone who wanted to meet the day respectfully. He stood in the hall for a moment as if listening to the house's breath, then stepped into the kitchen where Matilda was pouring tea. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Matilda replied, and she noticed at once that his hands were steady. Mrs. Pinner was already in motion, ladling porridge into bowls as if porridge were a moral duty. "Eat," she commanded Samuel. "Brains need fuel. And don't you tell me you've no appetite. Nerves don't count as nourishment." Samuel obeyed, and Matilda watched him take each spoonful, as though it were part of his preparation, not an interruption of it. The kettle sang. The clock ticked. The world outside waited without rushing in. When breakfast was done, Samuel stood, swallowed, and looked at Matilda. "Will you?" he began, then stopped himself, as if the old habit of apologizing had reached for his tongue. Matilda offered him a calm smile. "As far as the corner?" she said. "Yes." Samuel's shoulders eased. "Thank you," he said. Oliver arrived just as they were preparing to go, cheeks pink from the cold, scarf snug at his throat. He carried a small paper parcel. "I brought you something," he said to Samuel, holding it out. Samuel took it carefully and unwrapped it. Inside was a simple pencil new, sharpened, plain wood. Oliver's voice was gentle, almost shy. "For your first day," he said. "A clean start." Samuel stared at the pencil as though it were a rare thing. "Oliver," he murmured. "You didn't have to." Oliver shook his head. "It's only a pencil," he said. But his eyes said it was more than that. Jack arrived a breath later, of course, as if he could smell a moment that mattered. "I'm here," he announced, then lowered his voice dramatically. To witness the birth of a respected clerk, Mrs. Pinner leaned out of the kitchen doorway. "Don't you put your breath on him," she warned. "You'll jinx him." Jack pressed a hand to his chest. "Madam," he whispered, scandalized. "I would never jinx a man. I only charm." They stepped out into the morning fog together, Matilda and Samuel, Oliver beside them, Jack half a step ahead, talking in a stage whisper about the noble tradition of men walking to work. The street had that early, muffled quiet. The fog softened the chimneys and rooftops into gentle shapes. The gas lamps hissed faintly, waiting for the lamplighter's pole. A thin cold sat on the air, but the kind that could be managed with a scarf and a steady pace. As they passed the chapel square, Samuel's gaze drifted toward the gatehouse alcove. The candle was still there, its flame small but stubborn, protected by the stone's cupped shelter. It had burned through the night and into the morning, and though it was shorter now, it still glowed. Samuel paused, just a heartbeat, and Matilda saw him breathe in and out as if accepting something. "It's still burning," he murmured. Oliver nodded. Jack glanced at it, then at Samuel, and perhaps out of instinct, perhaps out of real tenderness, said nothing clever at all. He simply tipped his cap to the flame, as if acknowledging a quiet ceremony. They continued. At the narrow bookshop doorway beneath the hissing gas lamp, Mr. Brierly stood in his window, already awake and arranging his day. He looked up, saw the little procession, and lifted a hand in a small salute that was more blessing than greeting. Samuel touched his pocket where the card and notebook rested, then walked on. Fleet Street came into view with its busier hum, more carts, more voices, more feet. The smell of ink grew stronger, threaded with the scent of paper and glue. Hawthorne and Wick's window sat like a promise. Neat stacks of stationery, jars of pens, bundles of twine, sealing wax gleaming like little dark sweets. Samuel stopped before the door. Matilda stood beside him, neither pushing nor hovering, simply present. Oliver's calm presence was like a steady hand on the back without actually touching. Jack leaned against the shop front, trying to look casually heroic. Samuel drew a slow breath. "One step," Matilda murmured. Samuel nodded. He reached for the handle. The door creaked and opened. Warmth different from hearth warmth, but still human met them. Ink, paper, and the faint metallic scent of coins. Samuel stepped inside. Matilda remained outside with Oliver and Jack, giving him room. She watched through the window as Samuel approached the counter, coat buttoned, pencil tucked in his pocket, shoulders straight without stiffness. Mr. Wick, the man with the kettle temper Fagin had described, looked up. His moustache did indeed resemble a broom, and his expression began in a frown as though frowns were his preferred way of thinking. Samuel spoke. His mouth formed careful words. He handed over the card again, though he didn't need to now. Mr. Wick listened with that sharp stillness of someone who judged not by charm but by steadiness. Behind him, another man turned a little older, ink on his fingers, hair slightly disordered as if he'd run his hand through it while calculating. "Mr. Hawthorne," Matilda guessed. There was a brief exchange. Mr. Wick nodded once, curt. Samuel took off his coat, folded it neatly over his arm, and set it aside. He rolled up his sleeves with a careful competence. Matilda felt her breath release, slow and grateful. Oliver's voice was a quiet murmur at her side. "He'll do well," he said. Matilda nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "He will." Jack exhaled dramatically. "Now we wait," he declared, as if they were guarding a fortress. They did not wait long. A few minutes later, Mr. Wick came to the door and opened it, not stepping out fully, only leaning just enough to address them. "He started," Mr. Wick said gruffly. "He'll be here some hours." Oliver nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir." Mr. Wick grunted, then looked at Jack. "And you?" he said, suspicious. Jack smiled his most innocent smile. "I'm merely decorative," he said. "A bit of street scenery." Like fog, Mr. Wick's mouth tightened, uncertain whether he was amused. He closed the door without comment. Matilda, Oliver, and Jack began the walk back toward Ludgate Hill. The fog thinned further now, daylight brightening the city in its winter way. The gas lamps were being extinguished. London's edges sharpened slightly, but the air remained soft enough to breathe calmly. On the way, Oliver stopped at Fagin's shop and slipped inside for a moment. He emerged with a small bundle of papers, old receipts, and ledger scraps, likely for Samuel to practice with later, though now practice had become real work. Fagin himself appeared in the doorway, pretending he had simply been stepping out. "How'd it go?" he demanded at once, eyes bright. Matilda smiled. "He started," she said. Fagin sniffed. "Of course he started," he muttered. "I knew he would. He's got honest hands." Jack leaned in, whispering loudly. "You're pleased." Fagin glared. "I'm relieved," he snapped. "There's a difference." Oliver's tone was gentle. "You can be both," he said. Fagin made a frustrated sound, then retreated into the shop as though chased by his own feelings. "Go on," he called over his shoulder. "And mind you, keep the kettle hot. Work makes folk thirsty." Back at the boarding house, Matilda returned to her small duties with an even steadier heart. She tidied the parlour. She brewed tea. She adjusted the sign once more, though it was already straight. "Mrs." Pinner muttered about rent schedules and then, when she thought no one noticed, put an extra coal on the fire with a little more care than usual. The hours passed without drama. The clock ticked. The fog wandered in slow lanes beyond the window. The hearth held its glow. Late afternoon came, and with it the deepening of winter light. Gas lamps flickered to life again, their halos returning to the fog like gentle lanterns floating in milk. The front door bell chimed. Matilda rose at once, her heart lifting before her mind could reason it. Footsteps in the hall steady, not hurried. Samuel appeared in the parlour doorway. His cheeks were flushed from cold and from the day's effort, but his eyes looked clearer, tired. Yes, but not afraid. His shoulders had the ache of work in them, yet they were not hunched in defeat. He held his coat folded over his arm like a man who had learned where to put his hands. Matilda smiled softly. Samuel stepped into the warmth as if stepping into a familiar room now, rather than a borrowed one. "I did it," he said quietly, and his voice was a mixture of astonishment and calm. "All day, figures, pages, ink." Mr. Wick frowned most of the time, but Samuel's mouth twitched into a small smile. At one point he handed me a fresh sheet without scolding me for asking. That felt like trust. Oliver arrived a moment later, as if drawn by the story's turning. Jack followed, of course, bursting in with theatrical energy that softened immediately when he saw Samuel's face. "Well?" Jack demanded. "Did you survive the ink wars?" Samuel let out a quiet laugh. "I survived," he said, "and they want me back tomorrow." And the next day, Matilda poured tea. Mrs. Pinner, appearing in the doorway, nodded briskly as if she had expected nothing less, then retreated before she could be caught looking pleased. Samuel sat by the hearth, hands wrapped around his cup, and for a moment he simply looked at the fire as though it were the truest thing in the room. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out the notebook. He opened it, found the page he had written on the night before, and added a few more lines. When he finished, he closed it gently. "I wrote," he said quietly, as if sharing a secret. "Not sums, just gratitude, a reminder for when fog comes back." Matilda's eyes warmed. "That is a good thing to keep," she said. Samuel glanced up at the sign above the hearth. "Warm cups, quiet company." His voice was soft. "This place," he said, "feels like it's teaching me how to belong." Matilda sat opposite him, firelight warming her cheek, and felt her own heart settle into a deep, quiet ease. "Yes," she murmured, "that is what home does." Outside, fog and gaslight continued their slow, gentle dance along Ludgate Hill. Inside, the hearth glowed steadily, tea steamed, and the day's work, honest, ordinary, quietly brave, began to soften into evening calm. The days that followed began to knit themselves into something that felt quietly, steadily like a life. Not the sort of life that arrives with trumpets, or with sudden fortune, or with any grand declaration from the sky. It arrived the way warmth arrives in a winter room, by small degrees, by repetition, by the patient agreement between fire and coal and time. Samuel went to Fleet Street each morning, and returned each late afternoon with the particular tiredness that comes from honest work ink on his fingertips, a faint crease between his brows, from concentrating, and that curious mixture of exhaustion and pride that settles in the shoulders when a person has spent the day being useful. Mr. Wick remained a man of frowns, yet his frowns began to feel less like disapproval and more like his natural way of thinking. Mr. Hawthorne, ink-handed and quietly observant, spoke seldom but nodded often, and Samuel learned to value a nod the way one values a steady flame, not showy but reliable. At the boarding house, Mrs. Pinner made room for this new routine without admitting she was doing so. She shifted breakfast slightly earlier. She insisted Samuel's coat hang nearer the range. She began leaving a small plate covered with cloth in the kitchen. "For whoever comes in hungry," she said, as if the idea of naming Samuel would make her sentimental. Matilda watched all of it with a calm gratitude that sat deep in her chest. She was careful not to hover, not to smother Samuel with constant concern, but she kept the parlour steady in the ways she knew best. The kettle ready, the fire banked, the chairs angled toward warmth, the sign above the hearth, catching the glow as if it had always belonged there. Warm cups, quiet company. The words did something to the room. They seemed to lower the shoulders of anyone who read them, as if the very act of promising quiet company gave permission to exhale. Oliver came by often, sometimes with a small parcel from Fagin's shop, sometimes with nothing at all except his gentle presence. Jack came too, of course, drifting in with the ease of someone who had decided that Matilda's parlour was simply one of London's many features like fog, like gaslight, like pigeons only more comfortable. And Fagin hovered at the edges, appearing with an excuse and staying longer than the excuse required. He would claim he was only delivering a tin, or only retrieving a kettle, or only asking after some trivial thing. Yet Matilda noticed how his eyes always went first to Samuel, then to the fire, and then quickly, as if he might be caught to the sign. One evening, when the fog outside had thickened into a proper winter curtain and the lamps shone like amber pearls in milk, Matilda found herself preparing the parlour a little more carefully than usual. Not for a lodger, not for a stranger, not for an errand, for a kind of gathering. It began as a simple thought while she was folding linen, a cup of tea shared without hurry, a plate of biscuits set out without being covered, as if she feared someone might take too many. A room made deliberately welcoming, not just by habit but by choice. The thought warmed her, and she followed it the way one follows a familiar street. She placed the better cups on the table, the ones with a faint pattern at the rim. She set out the biscuit tin Fagin had left, and beside it a small dish of jam missus. Pinner claimed she didn't care about but guarded like treasure. She adjusted the chairs so they faced one another in a loose half-circle, the sort of arrangement that invited conversation but did not demand it. When Samuel arrived home, he paused in the doorway, noticing at once that the room had been prepared with intention. "Is something happening?" he asked softly. as if afraid to misread. Matilda smiled. "Only tea," she replied. "Only company, if you'd like it." Samuel's shoulders eased in visible relief that the invitation did not require performance. "I would," he said quietly. "Very much." Oliver arrived soon after, cheeks pink, his scarf damp with fog. Jack followed, smelling faintly of cold air and self-importance. Fagin arrived last, as if reluctant to appear eager, though he had clearly made his way there with purpose. He stood in the doorway and took in the scene. The cups, the biscuits, the fire, the sign glowing gently above it all. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "would you look at that? A proper tea room." Jack clapped his hands softly. "We've opened a business," he declared. "Mrs. Pinner, where's the license? Where's the queue?" Mrs. Pinner, emerging from the kitchen with a teapot as if she'd been summoned by the word tea room, fixed him with her stare. "The only queue here will be you, waiting to be thrown out if you get too noisy," she said. Jack bowed. "Madam, your hospitality is terrifying," he replied with admiration. They sat, and tea was poured. The steam rose in soft ribbons. The fire murmured. The clock ticked. Outside, the fog pressed its face to the windowpanes, curious but kept at a polite distance by the curtains and the warmth within. Samuel held his cup with both hands as if he were still learning how to receive things without flinching. His fingers bore a faint stain of ink, and Matilda found the sight oddly comforting proof of his day, proof of his steadiness. "How was it today?" Oliver asked, his voice gentle enough not to make the question feel like an interrogation. Samuel took a breath, and to Matilda's quiet pride, he did not begin with apology or minimizing. "It was steady," he said. "I copied figures until my eyes felt like they were made of paper." Fagin sniffed. "He's jealous," he said briskly. "He's been frowning the same way for 40 years. If you improve at it, he'll feel threatened." Jack leaned in, eyes bright. "Did you frown back?" Samuel's mouth twitched. "No," he said, "but I did. Breathe. When I felt myself tighten." Oliver nodded as if this were a victory worth honouring. "That's good," he said. Samuel glanced down at his cup, then back up, and his voice lowered slightly, as if he were confessing something tender. "And when the day ended," he added, "Mr. Hawthorne handed me a fresh sheet and said, 'Same time tomorrow.' He didn't say it kindly, he didn't say it harshly. He said it as though I was expected." Matilda felt her chest warm. "Expected?" she repeated softly. Samuel nodded. "Yes," he said, "as if there's a place where I'm meant to be." Fagin made a small sound, half pleased and half annoyed. "Of course there is," he muttered. "London's a beast, but it's a beast with plenty of nooks. You just have to find the right one." Jack raised his cup. "To nooks," he declared. Mrs. Pinner, who had settled into a chair with all the dignity of someone who had decided she would enjoy the moment and would not be caught enjoying it, lifted her cup too. "To rent," she said. Jack sighed. "She ruins poetry with practicality. She improves it," Matilda murmured, and Oliver's eyes warmed at that. Conversation wandered the way it ought to wander in a cosy room. From the weather to bread prices to a story Jack insisted was true about a dog who stole a pie and then returned the plate out of shame. Fagin contributed his own small observations, grumbling through kindness, like a man wrapping a gift in rough paper, so no one would accuse him of softness. Samuel listened more than he spoke. Yet when he did speak, there was less hesitation in him. The sound of his voice began to belong to the room. That, Matilda thought, was a kind of homecoming all by itself. At one point, Jack leaned back and eyed the sign above the hearth with theatrical seriousness. "You know," he said, "that sign's got power." Mrs. Pinner looked unimpressed. "It's wood," she said. Jack wagged a finger. "Yes, but it's wood that tells the truth," he insisted. "Warm cups, quiet company. That's a spell. That's how you keep the fog from creeping and stealing your peace." Fagin snorted. "Fog creeps in anyway," he said. "Not if you tell it no," Jack countered. Matilda smiled, and her gaze drifted to Samuel. He was looking at the sign too, but not as Jack did. No theatrics, no grand pronouncements. He looked as though he were memorizing it, taking it into himself like a line of scripture. Later, when the cups were empty and the biscuits had dwindled to crumbs, the gathering dissolved gently. No abrupt goodbyes, no sudden dispersal. Oliver rose first, as he often did, polite and quiet. Jack followed with exaggerated yawns. Fagin lingered, fiddling with his gloves as if he could not quite decide whether to go. At the door, Fagin paused and glanced back into the parlour. His eyes landed on Samuel. "Don't get too fond of those printers," he said gruffly. "They'll try to claim you." Samuel blinked, then smiled faintly. "I don't think they'll claim me," he said. "But I will work well." Fagin nodded sharply, pleased. "Good," he said. Then, after a moment, he added almost against his will, "And if they don't treat you right, you come tell me. I know how to make a man listen." Jack grinned. "With a map?" "With my mouth," Fagin snapped, and Jack laughed as he disappeared into the fog with Oliver. When the door closed and the house settled again, Matilda began tidying. Samuel remained in the parlour, watching the embers. "Would you like me to help?" he asked. "You already have," Matilda replied softly. Samuel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and drew out the notebook. He held it for a moment, then opened it. "I've been writing a little each night," he said quietly. "Not much. Just what I notice. What I'm grateful for. Small things." Matilda's eyes warmed. "That is a good habit," she said. Samuel's pencil hovered above the page. "Tonight," he said, "I wanted to write something different." He looked up at her, a little shy, but steady. "I wanted to draw," he said. "Not a map like Mr. Fagin's mind would be poor beside it, but a map of what has helped me." Matilda sat down again, giving him her full attention without making it feel heavy. Samuel bent over the page. His hand moved slowly, carefully. He drew simple lines, no flourish, no grand artistry. Yet as he worked, Matilda could see what he was doing, not merely marking streets, but marking meaning. A small square for the boarding house, a little curve for Ludgate Hill, a tiny dot for the bookshop doorway and its hissing lamp, a neat arch for the chapel gatehouse alcove, a warm circle for Fagin's shop, as if the lamps inside it were always lit, and in the parlour square he drew a small deliberate mark beside the hearth, then wrote 2 words in careful script, "Home here." When he finished, he sat back, and the breath he released sounded like relief. Matilda's throat tightened with tenderness. "That is a very fine map," she said softly. Samuel looked at it as though surprised it existed. "It feels true," he murmured. "It is," Matilda replied, "because it is yours." Samuel closed the notebook gently, as if tucking the map away for safekeeping. He looked up at the sign again, then at Matilda, and his voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I came here thinking home was a place I'd lost," he said. "But perhaps it's something that can be made again. In a room, in a cup of tea, in people who don't mind if you take up space." Matilda felt her own eyes sting, but she blinked slowly, letting the feeling be warm rather than sharp. "Yes," she whispered, "it can be made again." The fire sank lower, glowing rather than flaming. The clock ticked on. Outside, fog and gaslight continued to drift along Ludgate Hill with their patient, winter rhythm. Inside, the boarding house held its quiet company close, and the night softened into rest as naturally as a shawl slipping over shoulders. Samuel went upstairs and slept without rising again, and Matilda, before she went to bed, stood for a moment beneath the sign and let herself feel without rushing, without fear that her own homecoming was not behind her in a lost shop on another street, but here, in this hearth-warm parlour, where warmth had been offered and accepted, and where the fog could press at the window all it liked, but could not enter the room that kindness had made. A week later, on an evening when the fog had thinned into a silvery drift, and a fine rain began to tap at the windows like patient fingertips, Matilda found herself standing in the parlour doorway with a tray in her hands and a curious feeling in her chest, something between calm, satisfaction, and quiet wonder. The tray held no grand feast, only a teapot, 4 cups, a small plate of biscuits, and a dish of jam that Mrs. Pinner pretended was for general use, but watched as if it were made of gold. Yet the very act of carrying it through the house felt, to Matilda, like carrying her old tea-shop's bell and warmth in her hands, bringing the habit of welcome into the present, where it belonged. Samuel sat by the hearth with his notebook open, pencil poised, but his eyes were not on the page. They were on the rain tracing slow paths down the window pane, as if the weather itself were writing a letter to the room. "You're quiet," Matilda observed gently, setting the tray down. Samuel smiled without looking away from the glass. "I'm listening," he said, "to how it sounds when the rain meets the fog. It's softer than I expected." Matilda poured tea, the steam rising in pale ribbons. Samuel's gaze drifted to the sign above the hearth-crown's tea room. Warm cups, quiet company, and his voice lowered, as if speaking to something sacred in its ordinariness. "I never knew a sentence could feel like a blanket," he murmured. Before Matilda could answer, the bell at the front door chimed, and a gust of colder air slipped into the hall with the sound. Jack Dawkins arrived first, as he tended to do, bringing with him the impression that he'd been dashing through the weather in the service of drama. "Rain," he announced, shaking out his coat as if he'd wrestled a cloud. "The sky's leaking again." "Shoddy workmanship." Oliver followed, quieter, cheeks pink, scarf damp at the edges. He carried a small parcel wrapped neatly in brown paper, as if he'd brought something that should not be jostled. And then, with a grumble that tried very hard to sound like annoyance, came Fagin. He stepped into the parlour, took one look at the tray, the cups, the chair arrangement, and the sign glowing in firelight, and made a little sound that might have been satisfaction if he'd been the sort to admit it. "Well," he said, rubbing his hands together as if warming them was the only reason he'd come, "if you're determined to turn this into a proper tea room, I suppose I'd best see it meet standards." Jack's grin widened. "Standards," he cried. "Listen to him. He thinks he's the queen." Fagin shot him a look. "I'm the queen of this shop," he snapped. Then he nodded towards Samuel. "And you, Clark? How's the ink treating you?" Samuel's smile was small but steady. "It stains," he said, "but I don't mind. It feels like proof." Fagin huffed. "Ink's always proof," he muttered. "Proof that a person's been busy instead of brooding." Oliver settled into a chair near the hearth. Jack claimed the best biscuit with theatrical discretion. Matilda poured tea for them all, and as the cups warmed their hands, the room seemed to relax into itself like a cat settling more deeply into a cushion. They spoke, as they often did now, of small things that mattered. The weather, the price of paper, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery at dawn. Jack told a story about a pigeon that had attempted to steal a ribbon and got itself tangled in its own ambition. Oliver listened with that gentle half-smile that suggested he enjoyed Jack's nonsense as much as anyone, so long as it remained harmless. Samuel spoke a little more than he once had. His voice belonged to the room now. When he described Fleet Street, it was no longer with dread, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, as if the street had stopped being a test and become a place where he could simply go, do his work, and return. At one point, Oliver placed his parcel on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a thin wooden frame, plain but well made. "I thought," Oliver began, then paused, as if embarrassed by his own tenderness. Matilda leaned in. "What is it?" Oliver glanced at Fagin, who was pretending not to look interested. "Mr. Fagin helped me choose it," Oliver said. "He said a certain paper deserved to be kept safe." Fagin sniffed. "Don't put words in my mouth, boy," he muttered, though his eyes were bright. Samuel's gaze flicked to the folded hand-drawn map resting on the sideboard, kept there now like a small relic. Matilda felt her heart soften. "A frame," she whispered. Oliver nodded. "For the map," he said. "If you wanted. Not to make it grand. Only to keep it ready." Jack leaned forward, suddenly solemn in his own dramatic way. "Put it by the door," he urged. "So if any weary soul wanders in, they'll know this house understands roots." Mrs. Pinner appeared in the doorway at the mention of roots, carrying a folded cloth and a face arranged into briskness. "No one's wandering in without paying," she said. Jack smiled sweetly. "Of course not, but they may wander in and then pay later, after they've stopped shivering." Mrs. Pinner's mouth twitched. "Don't push your luck, Mr. Dawkins." Matilda looked at the frame, then at the map, and then quietly at Samuel. He met her gaze and nodded once, as if he understood what it meant. Not a display, but an open hand. "Yes," Matilda said softly. "We'll frame it." Fagin grumbled, satisfied. "Good," he said. "A map ought to be visible. It's no use hiding kindness in a pocket." Samuel reached for his notebook, then paused. "May I add something?" he asked, voice careful. Matilda's smile was warm. Of course. Samuel turned the notebook around and, on a fresh page, wrote a single line in neat script. He tore the page carefully, folded it once, then held it out to Matilda. She opened it and read, "If you found this room, you're not too late." Matilda's eyes stung. She blinked slowly and folded the paper again, holding it to her chest for a moment. Oliver's voice was a gentle murmur. "That's very good," he said. Jack sniffed loudly, as if offended by emotion. "I'm surrounded by poets," he declared. Fagin made a sound that might have been a cough. "Stick it in the frame," he said brusquely. "Behind the map or beside it. People need words as well as directions." So they did it then and there, without ceremony. The map was unfolded, its street names, its tiny lamp drawings, its gentle instruction to knock twice, then once. Samuel's little note was placed behind it in such a way that the words could still be read, tucked in the corner like a quiet companion. Oliver held the frame steady. Jack insisted on being useful, and nearly dropped a nail, then recovered it with a flourish. Fagin muttered about crookedness, and measured with his eyes as if he were levelling a cathedral. Mrs. Pinner insisted the nail be strong enough not to fall on anyone's head. Matilda watched, hands clasped, feeling as if the room were being stitched into something lasting. When it was done, the framed map hung near the doorway, close enough to be seen by anyone entering, close enough to be reached without fuss. A guided route, yes, but also a declaration. This house knew how to make room. The rain continued its soft tapping outside. The fog pressed gently to the glass, and the gas lamps beyond made pale halos in the mist. Inside, the hearth glowed, and the cups warmed hands, and the little group sat in quiet satisfaction beneath the sign and the framed map. Later, after Oliver and Jack had gone, and Fagin had retreated into the fog with his coat collar turned up, still grumbling, still caring, Matilda found Samuel lingering by the frame. He did not touch it. He only looked, as if letting the sight settle into him. "Mrs. Crown," he said softly, "may I do something before bed?" Matilda's voice was gentle. "What is it?" Samuel hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I want to walk to the chapel," he said. "Not because I need it, because I don't. And I think that matters." Matilda understood at once. "I'll come with you," she said. They stepped out into the night. The rain was light, more memory than downpour, and the fog held the street in a quiet embrace. Gas lamps burned with their steady hiss, casting amber halos that made every cobble shine softly. Their footsteps sounded muted, as if the city wished to keep their errand gentle. At the narrow bookshop doorway, the hissing gas lamp seemed to greet them like an old acquaintance. The chapel square lay beyond, quieter still, the stone walls damp with mist. The gatehouse alcove waited, cupped and calm. The candle Samuel had lit that first morning was long gone, now only a stub remained, and a faint trace of wax on the stone. Yet someone, perhaps the verger, perhaps another passer-by, moved by the idea, had placed a small fresh candle there. It sat unlit, sheltered, ready. Samuel stared at it for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out a match. Oliver's habit had become his too, it seemed. He struck it, shielding the flame with his hand, and lit the candle gently. A small light bloomed in the alcove, steady and warm against the damp night. Samuel exhaled, slow and deep, as if releasing the last of his old cold. Matilda stood beside him, shawl drawn close, and listened to the rain and the fog and the tiny flame doing its quiet work. When they turned back toward Ludgate Hill, the city felt softer than ever, not because it had changed, but because Samuel had. And when they returned to the boarding house, the parlour's hearth glow welcomed them like an old friend. The sign above the mantel glimmered, the framed map waited by the door, and the house's breathing pipes, clock, settling wood, was the comforting rhythm of a place that had made room. Matilda banked the fire one last time, feeling the warmth in her hands and the quiet gratitude in her chest. And now, as this night grows still around you, you can let the story's bustle fade into the simplest comforts, fog kept politely outside, gaslight softened into halos, and the steady assurance of a hearth that does not hurry. Let your breathing loosen, as if each exhale smooths a crease in a well-loved blanket. Feel the weight of your covers settle more fully over your shoulders and down your arms. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands rest without holding anything at all. Imagine the warmth of a cup held between your palms, tea steam rising, gentle and fragrant, while the rain taps faintly at the window, not demanding attention, only offering its quiet rhythm. In Matilda's parlour, the fire has burned down to embers, and the room has that late-night hush that feels almost sacred. The clock ticks with steady patience, and each tick seems to say, "There is time, there is time, there is time." The framed map by the door catches a final glimmer of lamplight when a carriage passes outside, and then the light drifts away again, swallowed kindly by fog. Samuel's room upstairs is quiet. You can picture the small bed made neat, the coat hung carefully, the day's ink stain washed from fingers. No urgent thoughts are pacing the floor now, only the slow, natural heaviness of sleep gathering, like a shawl being drawn up over shoulders. The city beyond the glass keeps breathing soft wheels on cobbles, a distant bell, the faint hiss of a gas lamp, yet none of it presses too close. The world can move on without you for a while. You are allowed to rest, and in that chapel alcove, a single candle burns down in its own good time, the flame small and steady. It doesn't shout its light, it simply offers it, a gentle proof that warmth can be left behind without being missed, that kindness can be placed somewhere quietly and still matter. The fog drifts past it like a slow river, and the rain remembers itself in tiny taps, and the flame continues patient, calm, untroubled. If you like, you can imagine yourself walking those lamplit streets, not with hurry, not with worry, but with the unhurried certainty that there is a place for you at the end of the path. You can imagine the glow of a window in the fog, the promise of a hearth, the soft scent of tea leaves in a warm room. You can imagine a chair turned slightly toward the fire, a blanket folded there as if it had been waiting just for you. No proving, no striving, only arriving. Let the muscles in your shoulders loosen further, as if someone has gently unfastened a tight button. Let your breath slow into a rhythm that feels natural and easy. In and out, like the tide of warmth in a quiet room, like embers dimming as the night deepens. The parlour grows quieter still. Even the fire seems to whisper now rather than speak. The gaslight outside becomes a soft blur behind curtains. The rain's tapping turns into a lullaby of tiny, patient notes. Somewhere, a kettle sits cooling, its work done for the day, and the cups are stacked neatly, ready for morning. Nothing else is required. Dickensian Sleep Story will be here again whenever you need another gentle walk through fog and firelight. And if you'd like, you can tell us where you're listening from tonight. May your rest be warm as a hearth, your mind quiet as snow-softened streets, and your dreams as gentle as lamplight in the mist good night.